Chapter 21 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 21. It was for the moment an inexpressible relief to Dolly to recognise in the person who forced himself into the path so abruptly, and now stood directly in her way, Hugh of the Maypole, whose name she uttered in a tone of delighted surprise that came from her heart.
"Was it you?" she said. "How glad I am to see you, and how could you terrify me so?"
In answer to which he said nothing at all, but stood quite still, looking at her.
"Did you come to meet me?"
asked Dolly. Hugh nodded, and muttered something to the effect that he had been waiting for her, and had expected her sooner.
"I thought it likely they would send,"
said Dolly, greatly reassured by this. "Nobody sent me," was his sullen answer. "I came of my own accord." The rough bearing of this fellow, and his wild, uncouth appearance, had often filled the girl with a vague apprehension, even when other people were by, and had occasioned her to shrink from him involuntarily. The having him for an unbidden companion in so solitary a place, with the darkness fast gathering about them, renewed and even increased the alarm she had felt at first. If his manner had been merely dogged and passively fierce, as usual, she would have had no greater dislike to his company than she always felt, perhaps indeed would have been rather glad to have had him at hand. But there was something of coarse, bold admiration in his look, which terrified her very much. She glanced timidly towards him, uncertain whether to go forward or retreat, and he stood gazing at her like a handsome satyr. And so they remained for some short time, without stirring or breaking silence. At length Dolly took courage, shot past him, and hurried on. "Why do you spend so much breath in avoiding me?" said Hugh, accommodating his pace to hers, and keeping close at her side.
"I wish to get back as quickly as I can, and you walk too near me," answered Dolly.
"Too near?" said Hugh, stooping over her so that she could feel his breath upon her forehead. "Why too near? You're always proud to me, mistress."
"I am proud to no one. You mistake me," answered Dolly. "Fall back, if you please, or go on."
"Nay, mistress," he rejoined, endeavouring to draw her arm through his. "I'll walk with you." She released herself, and clenching her little hand, struck him with right good will. At this, Maypole Hugh burst into a roar of laughter, and passing his arm about her waist, held her in his strong grasp as easily as if she had been a bird.
"Oh, well done, mistress. Strike again. You shall beat my face, and tear my hair, and pluck my beard up by the roots, and welcome, for the sake of your bright eyes. Strike again, mistress, do. I like it."
"Let me go,"
she cried, endeavouring with both her hands to push him off.
"Let me go this moment."
"You had as good be kinder to me, sweet lips," said Hugh. "You had indeed. Come, tell me now, why are you always so proud? I don't quarrel with you for it. I love you when you're proud. You can't hide your beauty from a poor fellow, that's a comfort."
She gave him no answer, but as he had not checked her progress, continued to press forward as rapidly as she could. At length, between the hurry she had made, her terror, and the tightness of his embrace, her strength failed her, and she could go no further.
"Hugh!"
cried the panting girl.
"Good Hugh! If you will leave me, I will give you anything, everything I have, and never tell one word of this to any living creature."
"You had best not," he answered. "Harkee, little dove, you had best not. All about here know me and what I dare do if I have a mind. If ever you are going to tell, stop when the words are on your lips, and think of the mischief you'll bring, if you do, upon some innocent heads that you wouldn't wish to hurt a hair of. Bring trouble on me, and I'll bring trouble and something more on them in return. I care no more for them than for so many dogs. Not so much. Why should I? I'd sooner kill a man than a dog any day. I've never been sorry for a man's death in all my life, and I have for a dog's. There was something so thoroughly savage in the manner of these expressions, and the looks and gestures by which they were accompanied, that her great fear of him gave her new strength, and enabled her by a sudden effort to extricate herself and run fleetly from him. But Hugh was as nimble, strong, and swift of foot as any man in broad England, and it was but a fruitless expenditure of energy, for he had her in his encircling arms again before she had gone 100 yards. "Softly, darling, gently. Would you fly from rough Hugh that loves you as well as any drawing-room gallant?"
"I would,"
she answered, struggling to free herself again.
"I will. Help!"
"A fine for crying out," said Hugh. "A fine, pretty one, from your lips. I pay myself."
"Help! Help! Help!"
As she shrieked with the utmost violence she could exert, a shout was heard in answer, and another, and another.
"Oh, thank heaven!"
cried the girl in an ecstasy.
"Joe! Dear Joe! This way! Help!"
Her assailant paused, and stood irresolute for a moment, but the shouts drawing nearer and coming quick upon them forced him to a speedy decision. He released her, whispered with a menacing look, "Tell him, and see what follows," and leaping the hedge was gone in an instant. Dolly darted off and fairly ran into Joe Willet's open arms. "What is the matter? Are you hurt? What is it? Who was it? Where is he? What was he like?" With a great many encouraging expressions and assurances of safety were the first words Joe poured forth. But poor little Dolly was so breathless and terrified that for some time she was quite unable to answer him, and hung upon his shoulder, sobbing and crying as if her heart would break. Joe had not the smallest objection to have her hanging on his shoulder. No, not the least, though it crushed the cherry-coloured ribbons sadly, and put the smart little hat out of all shape. But he couldn't bear to see her cry. It went to his very heart. He tried to console her, bent over her, whispered to her, some say kissed her, but that's a fable. At any rate, he said all the kind and tender things he could think of, and Dolly let him go on, and didn't interrupt him once, and it was a good 10 minutes before she was able to raise her head and thank him. "What was it that frightened you?" said Joe. A man whose person was unknown to her had followed her, she answered. He began by begging, and went on to threats of robbery, which he was on the point of carrying into execution, and would have executed but for Joe's timely aid. The hesitation and confusion with which she said this, Joe attributed to the fright she had sustained, and no suspicion of the truth occurred to him for a moment. "Stop when the words are on your lips." 100 times that night, and very often afterwards when the disclosure was rising to her tongue, Dolly thought of that, and repressed it. A deeply rooted dread of the man, the conviction that his ferocious nature, once roused, would stop at nothing, and the strong assurance that if she impeached him, the full measure of his wrath and vengeance would be wreaked on Joe, who had preserved her. These were considerations she had not the courage to overcome, and inducements to secrecy too powerful for her to surmount. Joe, for his part, was a great deal too happy to inquire very curiously into the matter, and Dolly being yet too tremulous to walk without assistance, they went forward very slowly, and in his mind very pleasantly,
until the Maypole lights were near at hand, twinkling their cheerful welcome, when Dolly stopped suddenly, and with a half scream exclaimed,
"The letter!"
"What letter?" cried Joe.
"That I was carrying. Oh, I had it in my hand. My bracelet too," she said, clasping her wrist. "I have lost them both."
"Do you mean just now?" said Joe.
"Either I dropped them then, or they were taken from me,"
answered Dolly, vainly searching her pocket and rustling her dress.
"They are gone, both gone. What an unhappy girl I am!"
With these words, poor Dolly, who, to do her justice, was quite as sorry for the loss of the letter as for her bracelet, fell a-crying again, and bemoaned her fate most movingly. Joe tried to comfort her with the assurance that directly he had housed her in the Maypole, he would return to the spot with the lantern, for it was now quite dark, and make strict search for the missing articles, which there was great probability of his finding, as it was not likely that anybody had passed that way since, and she was not conscious that they had been forcibly taken from her. Dolly thanked him very heartily for this offer, though with no great hope of his quest being successful; and so, with many lamentations on her side, and many hopeful words on his, and much weakness on the part of Dolly, and much tender supporting on the part of Joe, they reached the Maypole bar at last, where the locksmith and his wife and old John were yet keeping high festival. Mr Willet received the intelligence of Dolly's trouble with that surprising presence of mind and readiness of speech for which he was so eminently distinguished above all other men. Mrs Varden expressed her sympathy for her daughter's distress by scolding her roundly for being so late, and the honest locksmith divided himself between condoling with and kissing Dolly, and shaking hands heartily with Joe, whom he could not sufficiently praise or thank. In reference to this latter point, old John was far from agreeing with his friend, for besides that he by no means approved of an adventurous spirit in the abstract, it occurred to him that if his son and heir had been seriously damaged in a scuffle, the consequences would assuredly have been expensive and inconvenient, and might perhaps have proved detrimental to the Maypole business. Wherefore, and because he looked with no favourable eye upon young girls, but rather considered that they and the whole female sex were a kind of nonsensical mistake on the part of nature, he took occasion to retire and shake his head in private at the boiler. Inspired by which silent oracle, he was moved to give Joe various stealthy nudges with his elbow, as a parental reproof and gentle admonition to mind his own business and not make a fool of himself. Joe, however, took down the lantern and lighted it, and arming himself with a stout stick, asked whether Hugh was in the stable.
"He's lying asleep before the kitchen fire, sir," said Mr Willet. "What do you want him for?"
"I want him to come with me to look after this bracelet and letter," answered Joe. "Halloa there! Hugh!" Dolly turned pale as death, and felt as if she must faint forthwith. After a few moments, Hugh came staggering in, stretching himself and yawning according to custom, and presenting every appearance of having been roused from a sound nap. "Here, sleepy head," said Joe, giving him the lantern. "Carry this, and bring the dog, and that small cudgel of yours, and woe betide the fellow if we come upon him."
"What fellow?"
growled Hugh, rubbing his eyes and shaking himself. "What fellow?" returned Joe, who was in a state of great valour and bustle. "A fellow you ought to know of and be more alive about. It's well for the like of you, lazy giant that you are, to be snoring your time away in chimney corners, when honest men's daughters can't cross even our quiet meadows at nightfall without being set upon by footpads and frightened out of their precious lives."
"They never rob me," cried Hugh with a laugh. "I've got nothing to lose, but I'd as lief knock 'em at head as any other men. How many are there?"
"Only one,"
said Dolly faintly, for everybody looked at her.
"And what was he like, mistress?"
said Hugh with a glance at young Willet, so slight and momentary that the scowl it conveyed was lost on all but her. About my height?
Not so tall,
Dolly replied, scarce knowing what she said. His dress? Said Hugh, looking at her keenly. Like any of ours now? I know all the people hereabouts, and maybe could give a guess at the man if I had anything to guide me. Dolly faltered, and turned paler yet, then answered that he was wrapped in a loose coat, and had his face hidden by a handkerchief, and that she could give no other description of him. You wouldn't know him if you saw him then, belike, said Hugh, with a malicious grin.
I should not,
answered Dolly, bursting into tears again.
I don't wish to see him. I can't bear to think of him. I can't talk about him any more. Don't go to look for these things, Mr. Joe. Pray don't. I entreat you not to go with that man.
Not to go with me? Cried Hugh. I'm too rough for them all. They're all afraid of me. Why, bless you, mistress, I've the tenderest heart alive. I love all the ladies, Mob, said Hugh, turning to the locksmith's wife. Mrs Varden opined that if he did, he ought to be ashamed of himself, such sentiments being more consistent, so she argued, with a benighted Mussulman or wild islander than with a staunch Protestant. Arguing from this imperfect state of his morals, Mrs Varden further opined that he had never studied the manual. Hugh admitting that he never had, and moreover that he couldn't read, Mrs Varden declared with much severity that he ought to be even more ashamed of himself than before, and strongly recommended him to save up his pocket money for the purchase of one, and further to teach himself the contents with all convenient diligence. She was still pursuing this train of discourse, when Hugh, somewhat unceremoniously and irreverently, followed his young master out, and left her to edify the rest of the company. This she proceeded to do, and finding that Mr Willet's eyes were fixed upon her with an appearance of deep attention, gradually addressed the whole of her discourse to him, whom she entertained with a moral and theological lecture of considerable length, in the conviction that great workings were taking place in his spirit. The simple truth was, however, that Mr Willet, although his eyes were wide open, and he saw a woman before him, whose head, by long and steady looking at, seemed to grow bigger and bigger until it filled the whole bar, was to all other intents and purposes fast asleep, and so sat leaning back in his chair with his hands in his pockets until his son's return caused him to wake up with a deep sigh, and a faint impression that he had been dreaming about pickled pork and greens, a vision of his slumbers which was no doubt referable to the circumstance of Mrs Varden's having frequently pronounced the word grace with much emphasis, which word entering the portals of Mr Willet's brain as they stood ajar, and coupling itself with the words before meat, which were there ranging about, did in time suggest a particular kind of meat, together with that description of vegetable which is usually its companion. The search was wholly unsuccessful. Joe had groped along the path a dozen times, and among the grass, and in the dry ditch, and in the hedge, but all in vain. Dolly, who was quite inconsolable for her loss, wrote a note to Miss Hairdale, giving her the same account of it that she had given at the Maypole, which Joe undertook to deliver as soon as the family were stirring next day. That done, they sat down to tea in the bar, where there was an uncommon display of buttered toast, and, in order that they might not grow faint for want of sustenance, and might have a decent halting-place or halfway house between dinner and supper, a few savoury trifles in the shape of great rashers of broiled ham, which being well cured, done to a turn, and smoking hot, sent forth a tempting and delicious fragrance. Mrs Varden was seldom very Protestant at meals, unless it happened that they were underdone or overdone, or indeed that anything occurred to put her out of humour. Her spirits rose considerably on beholding these goodly preparations, and from the nothingness of good works she passed to the somethingness of ham and toast with great cheerfulness. Nay, under the influence of these wholesome stimulants, she sharply reproved her daughter for being low and despondent, which she considered an unacceptable frame of mind, and remarked, as she held her own plate for a fresh supply, that it would be well for Dolly, who pined over the loss of a toy and a sheet of paper, if she would reflect upon the voluntary sacrifices of the missionaries in foreign parts, who lived chiefly on salads. The proceedings of such a day occasion various fluctuations in the human thermometer, and especially in instruments so sensitively and delicately constructed as Mrs Varden. Thus, at dinner, Mrs V. stood at summer heat, genial, smiling, and delightful. After dinner, in the sunshine of the wine, she went up at least 6 degrees, and was perfectly enchanting. As its effect subsided, she fell rapidly, went to sleep for an hour or so at temperate, and woke at something below freezing. Now she was at summer heat again, in the shade, and when tea was over, and old John, producing a bottle of cordial from one of the oaken cases, insisted on her sipping 2 glasses thereof in slow succession, she stood steadily at 90 for 1 hour and a quarter. Profiting by experience, the locksmith took advantage of this genial weather to smoke his pipe in the porch, and in consequence of this prudent management he was fully prepared, when the glass went down again, to start homewards directly. The horse was accordingly put in, and the chaise brought round to the door. Joe, who would on no account be dissuaded from escorting them until they had passed the most dreary and solitary part of the road, led out the grey mare at the same time, and having helped Dolly into her seat, more happiness, sprung gaily into the saddle. Then, after many good nights, and admonitions to wrap up, and glancing of lights, and handing in of cloaks and shawls, the chaise rolled away, and Joe trotted beside it, on Dolly's side, no doubt, and pretty close to the wheel too. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 22. It was a fine bright night, and for all her lowness of spirits, Dolly kept looking up at the stars in a manner so bewitching, and she knew it, that Joe was clean out of his senses, and plainly showed that if ever a man were, not to say over head and ears, but over the monument and the top of St. Paul's in love, that man was himself. The road was a very good one, not at all a jolting road or an uneven one, and yet Dolly held the side of the chaise with one little hand all the way. If there had been an executioner behind him, with an uplifted axe, ready to chop off his head if he touched that hand, Joe couldn't have helped doing it. From putting his own hand upon it as if by chance, and taking it away again after a minute or so, he got to riding along without taking it off at all, as if he, the escort, were bound to do that, as an important part of his duty, and had come out for the purpose. The most curious circumstance about this little incident was, that Dolly didn't seem to know of it. She looked so innocent and unconscious when she turned her eyes on Joe, that it was quite provoking. She talked, though, talked about her fright, and about Joe's coming up to rescue her, and about her gratitude, and about her fear that she might not have thanked him enough, and about their always being friends from that time forth, and about all that sort of thing. And when Joe said, not friends, he hoped, Dolly was quite surprised, and said not enemies, she hoped. And when Joe said, couldn't they be something much better than either, Dolly all of a sudden found out a star which was brighter than all the other stars, and begged to call his attention to the same, and was 10,000 times more innocent and unconscious than ever. In this manner they travelled along, talking very little above a whisper, and wishing the road could be stretched out to some dozen times its natural length. At least that was Joe's desire, when, as they were getting clear of the forest and emerging on the more frequented road, they heard behind them the sound of a horse's feet at a round trot, which, growing rapidly louder as it drew nearer, elicited a scream from Mrs Varden, and the cry, "A friend!" from the rider, who now came panting up, and checked his horse beside them. "This man again!" cried Dolly, shuddering. "Hugh," said Joe, "what errand are you upon?" "I come to ride back with you," he answered, glancing covertly at the locksmith's daughter. "He sent me." "My father," said poor Joe, adding under his breath with a very unfilial apostrophe, "Will he never think me man enough to take care of myself?" "Ay," returned Hugh to the first part of the inquiry. "The roads are not safe just now, he says, and you better have a companion." "Ride on, then," said Joe. "I'm not going to turn yet." Hugh complied, and they went on again. It was his whim or humour to ride immediately before the chaise, and from this position he constantly turned his head and looked back. Dolly felt that he looked at her, but she averted her eyes and feared to raise them once, so great was the dread with which he had inspired her. This interruption, and the consequent wakefulness of Mrs Varden, who had been nodding in her sleep up to this point, except for a minute or two at a time, when she roused herself to scold the locksmith for audaciously taking hold of her to prevent her nodding herself out of the chaise, put a restraint upon the whispered conversation, and made it difficult of resumption. Indeed, before they had gone another mile, Gabriel stopped at his wife's desire, and that good lady protested she would not hear of Joe's going a step further on any account whatever. It was in vain for Joe to protest, on the other hand, that he was by no means tired, and would turn back presently, and would see them safely past such a point, and so forth. Mrs Varden was obdurate, and being so, was not to be overcome by mortal agency. "Good night, if I must say it," said Joe sorrowfully. "Good night," said Dolly. She would have added, "Take care of that man, and pray don't trust him," but he had turned his horse's head, and was standing close to them. She had therefore nothing for it but to suffer Joe to give her hand a gentle squeeze, and when the chaise had gone on for some distance, to look back and wave it, as he still lingered on the spot where they had parted, with the tall dark figure of Hugh beside him. What she thought about, going home, and whether the coachmaker held as favourable a place in her meditations as he had occupied in the morning, is unknown. They reached home at last, for it was a long way, made none the shorter by Mrs Varden's grumbling. Miggs, hearing the sound of wheels, was at the door immediately. "Here they are, Simon, here they are!" cried Miggs, clapping her hands and issuing forth to help her mistress to alight. "Bring a chair, Simon. Now, ain't you the better for it, Mim? Don't you feel more yourself than you would have done if you'd have stopped at home? Oh, gracious, how cold you are! Goodness me, sir, she's a perfect heap of ice."
"I can't help it, my good girl. You'd better take her into the fire," said the locksmith.
"Master sounds unfeeling, Mim," said Miggs in a tone of commiseration, "but such is not his intentions, I'm sure. After what he has seen of you this day, I never will believe but that he has a deal more affection in his heart than to speak unkind. Come in and sit yourself down by the fire, there's a good dear, do." Mrs Varden complied. The locksmith followed with his hands in his pockets, and Mr Tappertit trundled off with the chaise to a neighbouring stable.
"Martha, my dear," said the locksmith, when they reached the parlour, "if you'll look to Dolly yourself, or let somebody else do it, perhaps it will be only kind and reasonable. She has been frightened, you know, and is not at all well to-night." In fact, Dolly had thrown herself upon the sofa, quite regardless of all the little finery of which she had been so proud in the morning, and with her face buried in her hands, was crying very much. At first sight of this phenomenon, for Dolly was by no means accustomed to displays of this sort, rather learning from her mother's example to avoid them as much as possible, Mrs Varden expressed her belief that never was any woman so beset as she, and that her life was a continued scene of trial, that whenever she was disposed to be well and cheerful, so sure were the people around her to throw, by some means or other, a damp upon her spirits, and that, as she had enjoyed herself that day, and heaven knew it was very seldom she did enjoy herself, so she was now to pay the penalty. To all such propositions Miggs assented freely. Poor Dolly, however, grew none the better for these restoratives, but rather worse indeed, and seeing that she was really ill, both Mrs Varden and Miggs were moved to compassion, and tended her in earnest. But even then their very kindness shaped itself into their usual course of policy, and though Dolly was in a swoon, it was rendered clear to the meanest capacity that Mrs Varden was the sufferer. Thus, when Dolly began to get a little better, and passed into that stage in which matrons hold that remonstrance and argument may be successfully applied, her mother represented to her, with tears in her eyes, that if she had been flurried and worried that day, she must remember it was the common lot of humanity, and in especial of womankind, who through the whole of their existence must expect no less, and were bound to make up their minds to meek endurance and patient resignation. Mrs Varden entreated her to remember that one of these days she would, in all probability, have to do violence to her feelings so far as to be married, and that marriage, as she might see every day of her life, and truly she did, was a state requiring great fortitude and forbearance. She represented to her in lively colours that if she, Mrs V., had not, in steering her course through this vale of tears, been supported by a strong principle of duty which alone upheld and prevented her from drooping, she must have been in her grave many years ago, in which case she desired to know what would have become of that errant spirit, meaning the locksmith, of whose eye she was the very apple, and in whose path she was, as it were, a shining light and guiding star. Miss Miggs also put in her word to the same effect. She said that indeed and indeed Miss Dolly might take pattern by her blessed mother, who she always had said, and always would say, though she were to be hanged, drawn, and quartered for it next minute, was the mildest, amiablest, forgivingest-spirited, longest-sufferingest female as ever she could have believed. The mere narration of whose excellencies had worked such a wholesome change in the mind of her own sister-in-law, that, whereas before she and her husband lived like cat and dog, and were in the habit of exchanging brass candlesticks, pot-lids, flat-irons, and other such strong resentments, they were now the happiest and affectionatest couple upon earth, as could be proved any day on application at Golden Lion Court, No. 27, second bell-handle on the right-hand door-post. After glancing at herself as a comparatively worthless vessel, but still as one of some desert, she besought her to bear in mind that her aforesaid dear and only mother was of a weakly constitution and excitable temperament, who had constantly to sustain afflictions in domestic life, compared with which thieves and robbers were as nothing, and yet never sunk down or gave way to despair or wrath, but, in prize-fighting phraseology, always came up to time with a cheerful countenance, and went in to win as if nothing had happened. When Miggs finished her solo, her mistress struck in again, and the two together performed a duet to the same purpose, the burden being that Mrs Varden was persecuted perfection, and Mr Varden, as the representative of mankind in that apartment, a creature of vicious and brutal habits, utterly insensible to the blessings he enjoyed. Of so refined a character indeed was their talent of assault under the mask of sympathy, that when Dolly, recovering, embraced her father tenderly as in vindication of his goodness, Mrs Varden expressed her solemn hope that this would be a lesson to him for the remainder of his life, and that he would do some little justice to a woman's nature ever afterwards, in which aspiration Miss Miggs, by divers sniffs and coughs, more significant than the longest oration, expressed her entire concurrence. But the great joy of Miggs's heart was, that she not only picked up a full account of what had happened, but had the exquisite delight of conveying it to Mr Tappertit for his jealousy and torture. For that gentleman, on account of Dolly's indisposition, had been requested to take his supper in the workshop, and it was conveyed thither by Miss Miggs's own fair hands.
"Oh, Simon," said the young lady, "such goings on to-day! Oh, gracious me, Simon!"
Mr Tappertit, who was not in the best of humours, and who disliked Miss Miggs more when she laid her hand on her heart and panted for breath than at any other time, as her deficiency of outline was most apparent under such circumstances, eyed her over in his loftiest style, and deigned to express no curiosity whatever.
"I never heard the like, nor nobody else," pursued Miggs. "The idea of interfering with her! What people can see in her to make it worth their while to do so, that's the joke."
Finding there was a lady in the case, Mr Tappertit haughtily requested his fair friend to be more explicit, and demanded to know what she meant by her.
"Why, that Dolly," said Miggs,
with an extremely sharp emphasis on the name. "But, oh, upon my word and honour, young Joseph Willet is a brave one, and he do deserve her, that he do." "Woman," said Mr Tappertit, jumping off the counter on which he was seated, "beware!"
"My stars, Simmun!"
cried Miggs, in affected astonishment.
"You frightened me to death. What's the matter?"
"There are strings," said Mr Tappertit, flourishing his bread and cheese knife in the air, "in the human heart that had better not be vibrated. That's what's the matter."
"Oh, very well, if you're in a huff,"
cried Miggs, turning away.
"Huff or no huff," said Mr Tappertit, detaining her by the wrist. "What do you mean, Jezebel? What were you going to say? Answer me."
Notwithstanding this uncivil exhortation, Miggs gladly did as she was required, and told him how that their young mistress, being alone in the meadows after dark, had been attacked by 3 or 4 tall men, who would have certainly borne her away and perhaps murdered her, but for the timely arrival of Joseph Willet, who with his own single hand put them all to flight, and rescued her, to the lasting admiration of his fellow creatures generally, and to the eternal love and gratitude of Dolly Varden.
"Very good,"
said Mr Tappertit, fetching a long breath when the tale was told, and rubbing his hair up till it stood stiff and straight on end all over his head.
"His days are numbered."
"Oh, Simmun!"
"I tell you," said the 'prentice, "his days are numbered. Leave me. Get along with you."
Miggs departed at his bidding, but less because of his bidding than because she desired to chuckle in secret. When she had given vent to her satisfaction, she returned to the parlour, where the locksmith, stimulated by quietness and Toby, had become talkative, and was disposed to take a cheerful review of the occurrences of the day. But Mrs Varden, whose practical religion, as is not uncommon, was usually of the retrospective order, cut him short by declaiming on the sinfulness of such junketings, and holding that it was high time to go to bed. To bed, therefore, she withdrew, with an aspect as grim and gloomy as that of the Maypole's own state couch, and to bed the rest of the establishment soon afterwards repaired. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 23. Twilight had given place to night some hours, and it was high noon in those quarters of the town in which the world condescended to dwell, the world being then, as now, of very limited dimensions and easily lodged, when Mr Chester reclined upon a sofa in his dressing-room in the Temple, entertaining himself with a book. He was dressing, as it seemed, by easy stages, and having performed half the journey, was taking a long rest. Completely attired as to his legs and feet in the trimmest fashion of the day, he had yet the remainder of his toilet to perform. The coat was stretched, like a refined scarecrow, on its separate horse, the waistcoat was displayed to the best advantage, the various ornamental articles of dress were severally set out in most alluring order, and yet he lay dangling his legs between the sofa and the ground, as intent upon his book as if there were nothing but bed before him.
"Upon my honour," he said at length, raising his eyes to the ceiling with the air of a man who was reflecting seriously on what he had read. "Upon my honour, the most masterly composition, the most delicate thoughts, the finest code of morality, and the most gentlemanly sentiments in the universe. Ah, Ned, Ned, if you would but form your mind by such precepts, we should have but one common feeling on every subject that could possibly arise between us." This apostrophe was addressed, like the rest of his remarks, to empty air, for Edward was not present,
and the father was quite alone. "My Lord Chesterfield," he said, pressing his hand tenderly upon the book as he laid it down, "if I could but have profited by your genius soon enough to have formed my son on the model you have left to all wise fathers, both he and I would have been rich men. Shakespeare was undoubtedly very fine in his way, Milton good, though prosy, Lord Bacon deep, and decidedly knowing, but the writer who should be his country's pride is my Lord Chesterfield." He became thoughtful again, and the toothpick was in requisition. "I thought I was tolerably accomplished as a man of the world," he continued. "I flattered myself that I was pretty well versed in all those little arts and graces which distinguish men of the world from boors and peasants, and separate their character from those intensely vulgar sentiments which are called the national character. Apart from any natural prepossession in my own favour, I believed I was. Still, in every page of this enlightened writer, I find some captivating hypocrisy which has never occurred to me before, or some superlative piece of selfishness to which I was utterly a stranger. I should quite blush for myself before this stupendous creature, if, remembering his precepts, one might blush at anything. An amazing man, a noble man indeed. Any king or queen may make a lord, but only the devil himself and the Graces can make a Chesterfield." Men who are thoroughly false and hollow seldom try to hide those vices from themselves, and yet in the very act of avowing them they lay claim to the virtues they feign most to despise. "For," say they, "this is honesty, this is truth. All mankind are like us, but they have not the candour to avow it." The more they affect to deny the existence of any sincerity in the world, the more they would be thought to possess it in its boldest shape, and this is an unconscious compliment to truth on the part of these philosophers, which will turn the laugh against them to the day of judgment. Mr Chester, having extolled his favourite author, as above recited, took up the book again in the excess of his admiration, and was composing himself for a further perusal of its sublime morality, when he was disturbed by a noise at the outer door, occasioned as it seemed by the endeavours of his servant to obstruct the entrance of some unwelcome visitor. "A late hour for an importunate creditor," he said, raising his eyebrows with as indolent an expression of wonder as if the noise were in the street, and one with which he had not the smallest possible concern. "Much after their accustomed time. The usual pretence, I suppose. No doubt a heavy payment to make up to-morrow. Poor fellow! He loses time, and time is money, as the good proverb says. I never found it out, though. Well, what now? You know I am not at home." "A man, sir," replied the servant, who was to the full as cool and negligent in his way as his master, "has brought home the riding whip you lost the other day. I told him you were out, but he said he was to wait while I brought it in, and wouldn't go till I did." "He was quite right," returned his master, "and you're a blockhead, possessing no judgment or discretion whatever. Tell him to come in, and see that he rubs his shoes for exactly 5 minutes first." The man laid the whip on a chair, and withdrew. The master, who had only heard his foot upon the ground, and had not taken the trouble to turn round and look at him, shut his book, and pursued the train of ideas his entrance had disturbed. "If time were money," he said, handling his snuff-box, "I would compound with my creditors, and give them, let me see, how much a day? There's my nap after dinner, an hour, extremely welcome to that, and to make the most of it. In the morning, between my breakfast and the paper, I could spare them another hour. In the evening before dinner, say another. 3 hours a day. They might pay themselves in calls, with interest in 12 months. I think I shall propose it to them. Ah, my centaur, are you there?" "Here I am," replied Hugh, striding in, followed by a dog as rough and sullen as himself. "And trouble enough I've had to get here. What do you ask me to come for, and keep me out when I do come?" "My good fellow," returned the other, raising his head a little from the cushion, and carelessly surveying him from top to toe, "I am delighted to see you, and to have, in your being here, the very best proof that you are not kept out. How are you?" "I'm well enough," said Hugh impatiently. "You look a perfect marvel of health. Sit down." "I'd rather stand," said Hugh. "Please yourself, my good fellow," returned Mr Chester, rising, slowly pulling off the loose robe he wore, and sitting down before the dressing-glass. "Please yourself, by all means." Having said this in the politest and blandest tone possible, he went on dressing, and took no further notice of his guest, who stood in the same spot as uncertain what to do next, eyeing him sulkily from time to time. "Are you going to speak to me, master?" he said, after a long silence. "My worthy creature," returned Mr Chester, "you're a little ruffled and out of humour. I'll wait till you're quite yourself again. I am in no hurry." This behaviour had its intended effect. It humbled and abashed the man, and made him still more irresolute and uncertain. Hard words he could have returned, violence he would have repaid with interest, but this cool, complacent, contemptuous, self-possessed reception caused him to feel his inferiority more completely than the most elaborate arguments. Everything contributed to this effect. His own rough speech contrasted with the soft, persuasive accents of the other, his rude bearing and Mr Chester's polished manner, the disorder and negligence of his ragged dress, and the elegant attire he saw before him, with all the unaccustomed luxuries and comforts of the room, and the silence that gave him leisure to observe these things, and feel how ill at ease they made him. All these influences, which have too often some effect on tutored minds, and become of almost resistless power when brought to bear on such a mind as his, quelled Hugh completely. He moved by little and little nearer to Mr Chester's chair, and glancing over his shoulder at the reflection of his face in the glass, as if seeking for some encouragement in its expression, said at length, with a rough attempt at conciliation, "Are you going to speak to me, master, or am I to go away?" "Speak you?" said Mr Chester. "Speak you, good fellow? I have spoken, have I not? I am waiting for you." "Why, look ye, sir," returned Hugh with increased embarrassment, "am I the man that you privately left your whip with before you rode away from the Maypole, and told to bring it back whenever he might want to see you on a certain subject?" "No doubt the same. Or you have a twin brother," said Mr Chester, glancing at the reflection of his anxious face, "which is not probable, I should say." "Then I have come, sir," said Hugh, "and I have brought it back, and something else along with it. A letter, sir, it is, that I took from the person who had charge of it." As he spoke, he laid upon the dressing-table Dolly's lost epistle, the very letter that had cost her so much trouble. "Did you obtain this by force, my good fellow?" said Mr Chester, casting his eye upon it without the least perceptible surprise or pleasure. "Not quite," said Hugh. "Partly." "Who was the messenger from whom you took it?" "A woman, one Varden's daughter." "Oh, indeed," said Mr Chester gaily. "What else did you take from her?" "What else?" "Yes," said the other in a drawling manner, for he was fixing a very small patch of sticking plaster on a very small pimple near the corner of his mouth. "What else?" "Well, a kiss," replied Hugh after some hesitation. "And what else?" "Nothing." "I think," said Mr Chester, in the same easy tone, and smiling twice or thrice to try if the patch adhered, "I think there was something else. I have heard a trifle of jewellery spoken of. A mere trifle. A thing of such little value indeed that you may have forgotten it. Do you remember anything of the kind, such as a bracelet now, for instance?' Hugh, with a muttered oath, thrust his hand into his breast, and drawing the bracelet forth, wrapped in a scrap of hay, was about to lay it on the table likewise, when his patron stopped his hand and bade him put it up again. 'You took that for yourself, my excellent friend,' he said, 'and may keep it. I am neither a thief nor a receiver. Don't show it to me. You had better hide it again, and lose no time. Don't let me see where you put it either,' he added, turning away his head. 'You're not a receiver?' said Hugh bluntly, despite the increasing awe in which he held him. 'What do you call that, master?' striking the letter with his heavy hand. 'I call that quite another thing,' said Mr Chester coolly. 'I shall prove it presently, as you will see. You are thirsty, I suppose?' Hugh drew his sleeve across his lips, and gruffly answered yes. 'Step to that closet, and bring me a bottle you will see there, and a glass.' He obeyed. His patron followed him with his eyes, and when his back was turned, smiled as he had never done when he stood beside the mirror. On his return he filled the glass, and bade him drink. That dram dispatched, he poured him out another, and another. 'How many can you bear?' he said, filling the glass again. 'As many as you like to give me. Pour on. Fill high. A bumper with a bead in the middle. Give me enough of this,' he added as he tossed it down his hairy throat, 'and I'll do murder, if you ask me.' 'As I don't mean to ask you, and you might possibly do it without being invited if you went on much further,' said Mr Chester with great composure, 'we will stop, if agreeable to you, my good friend, at the next glass. You were drinking before you came here.' 'I always am when I get it,' cried Hugh boisterously, waving the empty glass above his head, and throwing himself into a rude dancing attitude. 'I always am. Why not? Ha 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 ha! What's so good to me as this? Whatever has been? What else has kept away the cold on bitter nights and driven hunger off in starving times? What else has given me the strength and courage of a man when men would have left me to die a puny child? I should never have had a man's heart but for this. I should have died in a ditch. Where's he who, when I was a weak and sickly wretch, with trembling legs and fading sight, bade me cheer up, as this did? I never knew him, not I. I drink to the drink, master. You're an exceedingly cheerful young man,' said Mr Chester, putting on his cravat with great deliberation, and slightly moving his head from side to side to settle his chin in its proper place. 'Quite a boon companion.' 'Do you see this hand, master?' said Hugh, 'and this arm?' baring the brawny limb to the elbow. 'It was once mere skin and bone, and would have been dust in some poor churchyard by this time, but for the drink.' 'You may cover it,' said Mr Chester. 'It's sufficiently real in your sleeve.' 'I should never have been spirited up to take a kiss from the proud little beauty, master, but for the drink,' cried Hugh. 'It was a good one, as sweet as honeysuckle, I warrant you. I thank the drink for it. I'll drink to the drink again, master. Fill me one more. Come, one more.' 'You are such a promising fellow,' said his patron, putting on his waistcoat with great nicety, and taking no heed of this request, 'that I must caution you against having too many impulses from the drink, and getting hung before your time. What's your age?' 'I don't know.' 'At any rate,' said Mr Chester, 'you are young enough to escape what I may call a natural death for some years to come. How can you trust yourself in my hands on so short an acquaintance, with a halter round your neck? What a confiding nature yours must be.' Hugh fell back a pace or two, and surveyed him with a look of mingled terror, indignation, and surprise. Regarding himself in the glass with the same complacency as before, and speaking as smoothly as if he were discussing some pleasant chit-chat of the town, his patron went on. Robbery on the King's highway, my young friend, is a very dangerous and ticklish occupation. It is pleasant, I have no doubt, while it lasts, but like many other pleasures in this transitory world, it seldom lasts long. And really, if in the ingenuousness of youth you open your heart so readily on the subject, I am afraid your career will be an extremely short one. How's this? Said Hugh. What you talk of, master? Who was it set me on? Who? Said Mr Chester, wheeling sharply round and looking full at him for the first time. I didn't hear you. Who was it? Hugh faltered, and muttered something which was not audible. Who was it? I'm curious to know, said Mr Chester, with surpassing affability. Some rustic beauty, perhaps? But be cautious, my good friend. They are not always to be trusted. Do take my advice now, and be careful of yourself. With these words he turned to the glass again, and went on with his toilet. Hugh would have answered him that he, the questioner himself, had set him on, but the words stuck in his throat. The consummate art with which his patron had led him to this point, and managed the whole conversation, perfectly baffled him. He did not doubt that if he had made the retort which is on his lips when Mr Chester turned round and questioned him so keenly, he would straightway have given him into custody, and had him dragged before a justice with the stolen property upon him, in which case it was as certain he would have been hung as it was that he had been born. The ascendancy which it was the purpose of the man of the world to establish over this savage instrument was gained from that time. Hugh's submission was complete. He dreaded him beyond description, and felt that accident and artifice had spun a web about him, which at a touch from such a master hand as his would bind him to the gallows. With these thoughts passing through his mind, and yet wondering at the very same time how he who came there rioting in the confidence of this man, as he thought, should be so soon and so thoroughly subdued, Hugh stood cowering before him, regarding him uneasily from time to time while he finished dressing. When he had done so, he took up the letter, broke the seal, and throwing himself back in his chair, read it leisurely through. Very neatly worded, upon my life. Quite a woman's letter, full of what people call tenderness and disinterestedness and heart and all that sort of thing. As he spoke, he twisted it up, and glancing lazily round at Hugh as though he would say, "You see this?" held it in the flame of the candle. When it was in a full blaze, he tossed it into the grate, and there it smouldered away. "It was directed to my son," he said, turning to Hugh, "and you did quite right to bring it here. I opened it on my own responsibility, and you see what I have done with it. Take this for your trouble." Hugh stepped forward to receive the piece of money he held out to him. As he put it in his hand, he added, "If you should happen to find anything else of this sort, or to pick up any kind of information you may think I would like to have, bring it here, will you, my good fellow?" This was said with a smile, which implied, or Hugh thought it did, fail to do so at your peril. He answered that he would. "And don't," said his patron, with an air of the very kindest patronage, "don't be at all downcast or uneasy respecting that little rashness we have been speaking of. Your neck is as safe in my hands, my good fellow, as though a baby's fingers clasped it, I assure you. Take another glass. You are quieter now." Hugh accepted it from his hand, and looking stealthily at his smiling face, drank the contents in silence. "Don't you Don't you drink to the drink any more?' said Mr Chester, in his most winning manner. 'To you, sir,' was the sullen answer, with something approaching to a bow. 'I drink to you.' 'Thank you. God bless you. By the by, what is your name, my good soul? You are called Hugh, I know, of course. Your other name?' 'I have no other name.' 'A very strange fellow. Do you mean that you never knew one, or that you don't choose to tell it? Which?' 'I'd tell it if I could,' said Hugh quickly. 'I can't. I've been always called Hugh. Nothing more. I never knew, nor saw, nor thought about a father, and I was a boy of 6, that's not very old, when they hung my mother up at Tyburn for a couple of thousand men to stare at. They might have let her live. She was poor enough.' 'Oh, how very sad!' exclaimed his patron with a condescending smile. 'I have no doubt she was an exceedingly fine woman.' 'You see that dog of mine?' said Hugh abruptly. 'Faithful, I dare say,' rejoined his patron, looking at him through his glass, 'and immensely clever. Virtuous and gifted animals, whether man or beast, always are so very hideous. Such a dog as that, and one of the same breed, was the only living thing except me that howled that day,' said Hugh. 'Out of the 2,000 odd, there was a larger crowd for its being a woman. The dog and I alone had any pity. If he'd have been a man, he'd have been glad to be quit of her, for she had been forced to keep him lean and half starved. But being a dog, and not having a man's sense, he was sorry.' 'It was dull of the brute, certainly,' said Mr Chester, 'and very like a brute.' Hugh made no rejoinder, but whistling to his dog, who sprung up at the sound and came jumping and sporting about him, bade his sympathizing friend good night. 'Good night,' he returned. 'Remember, you're safe with me, quite safe, so long as you deserve it, my good fellow, as I hope you always will. You have a friend in me, on whose silence you may rely. Now, do be careful of yourself, pray do, and consider what jeopardy you might have stood in. Good night. Bless you.' Hugh chuckled before the hidden meaning of these words, as much as such a being could, and crept out of the door so submissively and subserviently, with an air, in short, so different from that with which he had entered, that his patron, on being left alone, smiled more than ever. 'And yet,' he said, as he took a pinch of snuff, 'I do not like their having hanged his mother. The fellow has a fine eye, and I am sure she was handsome. But very probably she was coarse, red-nosed perhaps, and had clumsy feet. Aye, it was all for the best, no doubt.' With this comforting reflection, he put on his coat, took a farewell glance at the glass, and summoned his man, who promptly attended, followed by a chair and its 2 bearers. 'Pho!' said Mr Chester. 'The very atmosphere that centaurs breathed seems tainted with the cart and ladder. Here, Peak, bring some scent and sprinkle the floor, and take away the chair he sat upon and air it, and dash a little of that mixture upon me. I'm stifled.' The man obeyed, and the room and its master being both purified, nothing remained for Mr Chester but to demand his hat, to fold it jauntily under his arm, to take his seat in the chair, and be carried off, humming a fashionable tune. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 24.
How the accomplished gentleman spent the evening in the midst of a dazzling and brilliant circle, how he enchanted all those with whom he mingled by the grace of his deportment, the politeness of his manner, the vivacity of his conversation, and the sweetness of his voice, how it was observed in every corner that Chester was a man of that happy disposition that nothing ruffled him, that he was one on whom the world's cares and errors sat lightly as his dress, and in whose smiling face a calm and tranquil mind was constantly reflected. How honest men, who by instinct knew him better, bowed down before him nevertheless, deferred to his every word, and courted his favourable notice. How people who really had good in them went with the stream, and fawned and flattered and approved and despised themselves while they did so, and yet had not the courage to resist. How, in short, he was one of those who are received and cherished in society, as the phrase is, by scores who individually would shrink from and be repelled by the object of their lavish regard, are things, of course, which will suggest themselves. Matter so commonplace needs but a passing glance, and there an end. The despisers of mankind, apart from the mere fools and mimics of that creed, are of two sorts. They who believe their merit neglected and unappreciated make up one class. They who receive adulation and flattery, knowing their own worthlessness, compose the other. Be sure that the coldest-hearted misanthropes are ever of this last order. Mr Chester sat up in bed next morning, sipping his coffee and remembering with a kind of contemptuous satisfaction how he had shone last night, and how he had been caressed and courted when his servant brought in a very small scrap of dirty paper, tightly sealed in two places, on the inside whereof was inscribed in pretty large text these words: "A friend, desiring of a conference. Immediate. Private. Burn it when you've read it." "Where, in the name of the gunpowder plot, did you pick up this?" said his master. "It was given him by a person then waiting at the door," the man replied. "With a cloak and dagger?" said Mr Chester. With nothing more threatening about him, it appeared, than a leather apron and a dirty face. "Let him come in." In he came, Mr Tappertit, with his hair still on end, and a great lock in his hand, which he put down on the floor in the middle of the chamber, as if he were about to go through some performances in which it was a necessary agent. "Sir," said Mr Tappertit, with a low bow, "I thank you for this condescension, and am glad to see you. Pardon the menial office in which I am engaged, sir, and extend your sympathies to one who, humble as his appearance is, has inward workings far above his station." Mr Chester held the bed curtain farther back, and looked at him with a vague impression that he was some maniac, who had not only broken open the door of his place of confinement, but had brought away the lock. Mr Tappertit bowed again, and displayed his legs to the best advantage. "You have heard, sir," said Mr Tappertit, laying his hand upon his breast, "of G. Varden, locksmith and bell hanger, and repairs neatly executed in town and country, Clerkenwell, London?" "What then?" asked Mr Chester. "I'm his 'prentice, sir." "What then?" said Mr Tappertit. "Would you permit me to shut the door, sir? And will you further, sir, give me your honour bright that what passes between us is in the strictest confidence?" Mr Chester laid himself calmly down in bed again, and turning a perfectly undisturbed face towards the strange apparition, which had by this time closed the door, begged him to speak out, and to be as rational as he could, without putting himself to any very great personal inconvenience. "In the first place, sir," said Mr Tappertit, producing a small pocket handkerchief and shaking it out of the folds, "as I have not a card about me, for the envy of masters debases us below that level, allow me to offer the best substitute circumstances will admit of. If you will take that in your own hand, sir, and cast your eye on the right-hand corner," said Mr Tappertit, offering it with a graceful air, "you will meet with my credentials.'
'Thank you,' answered Mr Chester, politely accepting it, and turning to some blood-red characters at one end. 'For Simon Tappertit 1. Is that the—'
'Without the numbers, sir, that is my name,' replied the 'prentice. 'They are merely intended as directions to the washerwoman, and have no connection with myself or family. Your name, sir,' said Mr Tappertit, looking very hard at his nightcap, 'is Chester, I suppose. You needn't pull it off, sir, thank you. I observe E.C. from here. We will take the rest for granted.'
'Pray, Mr Tappertit,' said Mr Chester, 'has that complicated piece of ironmongery which you have done me the favour to bring with you any immediate connection with the business we are to discuss?'
'It has not, sir,' rejoined the 'prentice. 'It's going to be fitted on a warehouse door in Thames Street.'
'Perhaps, as that is the case,' said Mr Chester, 'and as it has a stronger flavour of oil than I usually refresh my bedroom with, you'll oblige me so far as to put it outside the door?'
'By all means, sir,'
said Mr Tappertit, suiting the action to the word. 'You'll excuse my mentioning it, I hope?'
'Don't apologise, sir, I beg. And now, if you please, to business.'
During the whole of this dialogue, Mr Chester had suffered nothing but his smile of unvarying serenity and politeness to appear upon his face. Sim Tappertit, who had far too good an opinion of himself to suspect that anybody could be playing upon him, thought within himself that this was something like the respect to which he was entitled, and drew a comparison from this courteous demeanour of a stranger, by no means favourable to the worthy locksmith.
'From what passes in our house,' said Mr Tappertit, 'I'm aware, sir, that your son keeps company with a young lady against your inclinations. Sir, your son has not used me well.'
'Mr Tappertit,' said the other, 'you grieve me beyond description.'
'Thank you, sir,' replied the 'prentice. 'I'm glad to hear you say so. He's very proud, sir, is your son. Very haughty.'
'I am afraid he is haughty,' said Mr Chester. 'Do you know, I was really afraid of that before, and you confirm me?'
'To recount the menial offices I've had to do for your son, sir,' said Mr Tappertit, 'the chairs I've had to hand him, the coaches I've had to call for him, the numerous degrading duties, wholly unconnected with my indenters, that I've had to do for him, would fill a family Bible. Besides which, sir, he is but a young man himself, and I do not consider, thank ye, Sim, a proper form of address on those occasions.'
'Mr Tappertit, your wisdom is beyond your years. Pray, go on.'
'I thank you for your good opinion, sir,' said Sim, much gratified, 'and will endeavour so to do. Now, sir, on this account, and perhaps for another reason or two which I needn't go into, I am on your side, and what I tell you is this, that as long as our people go backwards and forwards, to and fro, up and down, to that there jolly old maypole, lettering and messaging and fetching and carrying, you couldn't help your son keeping company with that young lady by deputy. Not if he was minded night and day by all the horse guards, and every man of 'em in the very fullest uniform.'
Mr Tappertit stopped to take breath after this, and then started fresh again.
'Now, sir, I am a coming to the point. You will inquire of me, how is this to be prevented? I'll tell you how. If an honest, civil, smiling gentleman like you—'
'Mr Tappertit, really?'
'No, I'm serious,' rejoined the 'prentice. 'I am, upon my soul. If an honest, civil, smiling gentleman like you was to talk but 10 minutes to our old woman, that's Mrs Varden, and flatter her up a bit,
you gain her over for ever. Then there's this point got, that her daughter Dolly,' here a flush came over Mr Tappertit's face, 'wouldn't be allowed to be a go-between from that time forward, and till that point's got, there's nothing ever will prevent her. Mind that.' 'Mr Tappertit, your knowledge of human nature—' 'Wait a minute,' said Sim, folding his arms with a dreadful calmness. 'Now I come to THE point, sir. There is a villain at that Maypole, a monster in human shape, a vagabond of the deepest dye, that unless you get rid of and have kidnapped and carried off at the very least, nothing less will do, will marry your son to that young woman, as certainly and as surely as if he was the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. He will, sir, for the hatred and malice that he bears to you, let alone the pleasure of doing a bad action, which to him is its own reward. If you knew how this chap, this Joseph Willet, that's his name, comes backwards and forwards to our house, libelling and denouncing and threatening you, and how I shudder when I hear him, you'd hate him worse than I do. Worse than I do, sir,' said Mr Tappertit wildly, putting his hair up straighter and making a crunching noise with his teeth. 'If sich a thing is possible.' 'A little private vengeance in this, Mr Tappertit?' 'Private vengeance, sir, or public sentiment, or both combined. Destroy him,' said Mr Tappertit. 'Miggs says so too. Miggs and me both say so. We can't bear the plotting and undermining that takes place. Our souls recoil from it. Barnaby Rudge and Mrs Rudge are in it likewise. But the villain, Joseph Willet, is the ringleader. Their plottings and schemes are known to me and Miggs. If you want information of him, apply to us. Put Joseph Willet down, sir. Destroy him, crush him, and be happy.' With these words, Mr Tappertit, who seemed to expect no reply, and to hold it as a necessary consequence of his eloquence that his hearer should be utterly stunned, dumbfoundered, and overwhelmed, folded his arms so that the palm of each hand rested on the opposite shoulder, and disappeared after the manner of those mysterious warners of whom he had read in cheap story-books. 'That fellow,' said Mr Chester, relaxing his face when he was fairly gone, 'is good practice. I have some command of my features, beyond all doubt. He fully confirms what I suspected, though, and blunt tools are sometimes found of use where sharper instruments would fail. I fear I may be obliged to make great havoc among these worthy people. A troublesome necessity. I quite feel for them.' With that, he fell into a quiet slumber, subsided into such a gentle, pleasant sleep that it was quite infantine. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 25. Leaving the favoured and well-received and flattered of the world, him of the world most worldly, who never compromised himself by an ungentlemanly action, and never was guilty of a manly one, to lie smilingly asleep, for even sleep, working but little change in his dissembling face, became with him a piece of cold, conventional hypocrisy. We follow in the steps of two slow travellers on foot, making towards Chigwell. Barnaby and his mother, Grip in their company, of course. The widow, to whom each painful mile seemed longer than the last, toiled wearily along, while Barnaby, yielding to every inconstant impulse, fluttered here and there,
now leaving her far behind, now lingering far behind himself, now darting into some by-lane or path, and leaving her to pursue her way alone, until he stealthily emerged again and came upon her with a wild shout of merriment, as his wayward and capricious nature prompted. Now he would call her from the topmost branch of some high tree by the roadside, now, using his tall staff as a leaping pole, come flying over ditch or hedge or 5-barred gate, now run with surprising swiftness for a mile or more on the straight road, and halting, sport upon a patch of grass with Grip till she came up. These were his delights, and when his patient mother heard his merry voice, or looked into his flushed and healthy face, she would not have abated them by one sad word or murmur, though each had been to her a source of suffering in the same degree as it was to him of pleasure. It is something to look upon enjoyment, so that it be free and wild and in the face of nature, though it is but the enjoyment of an idiot. It is something to know that heaven has left the capacity of gladness in such a creature's breast. It is something to be assured that, however lightly men may crush that faculty in their fellows, the great Creator of mankind imparts it even to his despised and slighted work. Who would not rather see a poor idiot happy in the sunlight than a wise man pining in a darkened jail? Ye men of gloom and austerity, who paint the face of infinite benevolence with an eternal frown, read in the everlasting book, wide open to your view, the lesson it would teach. Its pictures are not in black and sombre hues, but bright and glowing tints. Its music, save when ye drown it, is not in sighs and groans, but songs and cheerful sounds. Listen to the million voices in the summer air, and find one dismal as your own. Remember, if you can, the sense of hope and pleasure which every glad return of day awakens in the breast of all your kind who have not changed their nature, and learn some wisdom even from the witless, when their hearts are lifted up, they know not why, by all the mirth and happiness it brings. The widow's breast was full of care, was laden heavily with secret dread and sorrow, but her boy's gaiety of heart gladdened her, and beguiled the long journey. Sometimes he would bid her lean upon his arm, and would keep beside her steadily for a short distance, but it was more his nature to be rambling to and fro, and she better liked to see him free and happy, even than to have him near her, because she loved him better than herself. She had quitted the place to which they were travelling, directly after the event which had changed her whole existence, and for 22 years had never had courage to revisit it. It was her native village. How many recollections crowded on her mind when it appeared in sight! 22 years, her boy's whole life and history. The last time she looked back upon those roofs among the trees, she carried him in her arms, an infant. How often since that time had she sat beside him night and day, watching for the dawn of mind that never came? How had she feared and doubted and yet hoped, long after conviction forced itself upon her? The little stratagems she had devised to try him, the little tokens he had given in his childish way, not of dullness but of something infinitely worse, so ghastly and unchildlike in its cunning, came back as vividly as if but yesterday had intervened. The room in which they used to be, the spot in which his cradle stood, he, old and elfin-like in face, but ever dear to her, gazing at her with a wild and vacant eye, and crooning some uncouth song as she sat by and rocked him, every circumstance of his infancy came thronging back, and the most trivial perhaps, the most distinctly. His older childhood too, the strange imaginings he had, his terror of certain senseless things, familiar objects he endowed with life, the slow and gradual breaking out of that one horror in which, before his birth, his darkened intellect began. How, in the midst of all, she had found some hope and comfort in his being unlike another child, and had gone on almost believing in the slow development of his mind until he grew a man, and then his childhood was complete and lasting. One after another, all these old thoughts sprung up within her, strong after their long slumber and bitterer than ever. She took his arm, and they hurried through the village street. It was the same as it was wont to be in old times, yet different too, and wore another air. The change was in herself, not it, but she never thought of that, and wondered at its alteration, and where it lay, and what it was. The people all knew Barnaby, and the children of the place came flocking round him, as she remembered to have done with their fathers and mothers round some silly beggar-man, when a child herself. None of them knew her. They passed each well-remembered house, and yard, and homestead, and striking into the fields, were soon alone again. The warren was the end of their journey. Mr Hairdale was walking in the garden, and seeing them as they passed the iron gate, unlocked it and bade them enter that way. "At length you have mustered heart to visit the old place," he said to the widow. "I am glad you have."
"For the first time, and the last, sir," she replied.
"The first for many years, but not the last?"
"The very last."
"You mean," said Mr Haredale, regarding her with some surprise, "that, having made this effort, you are resolved not to persevere and are determined to relapse? This is unworthy of you. I have often told you you should return here. You would be happier here than elsewhere, I know. As to Barnaby, it's quite his home."
"And Grips,"
said Barnaby, holding the basket open. The raven hopped gravely out, perching on his shoulder and addressing himself to Mr Haredale, cried, as a hint, perhaps, that some temperate refreshment would be acceptable,
"Ollie, put the kettle on. We'll all have tea."
"Hear me, Mary," said Mr Haredale kindly, as he motioned her to walk with him towards the house. "Your life has been an example of patience and fortitude, except in this one particular, which has often given me great pain. It is enough to know that you were cruelly involved in the calamity which deprived me of an only brother, and Emma of her father, without being obliged to suppose, as I sometimes am, that you associate us with the author of our joint misfortunes."
"Associate you with him, sir?"
she cried.
"Indeed," said Mr Haredale, "I think you do. I almost believe that because your husband was bound by so many ties to our relation, and died in his service and defence, you have come in some sort to connect us with his murder."
"Alas!" she answered, "you little know my heart, sir. You little know the truth."
"It is natural you should do so. It is very probable you may, without being conscious of it," said Mr Haredale, speaking more to himself than her. "We are a fallen house. Money, dispensed with the most lavish hand, would be a poor recompense for sufferings like yours, and thinly scattered by hands so pinched and tied as ours, it becomes a miserable mockery. I feel it so, God knows," he added hastily. "Why should I wonder if she does?"
"You do me wrong, dear sir, indeed," she rejoined with great earnestness. "And yet, when you come to hear what I desire your leave to say—"
"I shall find my doubts confirmed," he said, observing that she faltered and became confused. "Well?"
He quickened his pace for a few steps, but fell back again to her side, and said,
"And have you come all this way at last, solely to speak to me?"
She answered, "Yes."
"A curse," he muttered, "upon the wretched state of us proud beggars, from whom the poor and rich are equally at a distance, the one being forced to treat us with a show of cold respect, the other condescending to us in their every deed and word, and keeping more aloof the nearer they approach us. Why, if it were pain to you, as it must have been, to break for this slight purpose the chain of habit, forged through 22 years, could you not let me know your wish, and beg me to come to you?"
"There was not time, sir," she rejoined. "I took my resolution but last night, and taking it felt that I must not lose a day, an hour, in having speech with you."
They had by this time reached the house. Mr Haredale paused for a moment and looked at her as if surprised by the energy of her manner. Observing, however, that she took no heed of him, but glanced up, shuddering, at the old walls with which such horrors were connected in her mind, he led her by a private stair into his library, where Emma was seated in a window reading. The young lady, seeing who approached, hastily rose and laid aside her book, and with many kind words, and not without tears, gave her a warm and earnest welcome. But the widow shrunk from her embrace, as though she feared her, and sunk down trembling on a chair.
"It is the return to this place after so long an absence," said Emma gently. "Pray ring, dear uncle, or stay. Barnaby will run himself and ask for wine."
"Not for the world," she cried. "It would have another taste. I could not touch it. I want but a minute's rest, nothing but that."
Miss Haredale stood beside her chair, regarding her with silent pity. She remained for a little time quite still, then rose and turned to Mr Hairdale, who had sat down in his easy chair, and was contemplating her with fixed attention. The tale connected with the mansion borne in mind, it seemed, as has been already said, the chosen theatre for such a deed as it had known. The room in which this group were now assembled, hard by the very chamber where the act was done, dull, dark, and sombre, heavy with worm-eaten books, deadened and shut in by faded hangings, muffling every sound, shadowed mournfully by trees whose rustling boughs gave ever and anon a spectral knocking at the glass, wore, beyond all others in the house, a ghostly, gloomy air, nor were the group assembled there unfitting tenants of the spot. The widow, with her marked and startling face and downcast eyes, Mr Hairdale, stern and despondent ever, his niece beside him, like, yet most unlike, the picture of her father, which gazed reproachfully down upon them from the blackened wall, Barnaby, with his vacant look and restless eye, were all in keeping with the place, and actors in the legend. Nay, the very raven who had hopped upon the table, and with the air of some old necromancer, appeared to be profoundly studying a great folio volume that lay open on a desk, and was strictly in unison with the rest, and looked like the embodied spirit of evil biding his time of mischief.
"I scarcely know," said the widow, breaking silence, "how to begin. You will think my mind disordered."
"The whole tenor of your quiet and reproachless life since you were last here," returned Mr Hairdale mildly, "shall bear witness for you. Why do you fear to awaken such a suspicion? You do not speak to strangers. You have not to claim our interest or consideration for the first time. Be more yourself. Take heart. Any advice or assistance that I can give you, you know is yours of right, and freely yours."
"What if I came, sir," she rejoined, "I, who have but one other friend on earth, to reject your aid from this moment, and to say that henceforth I launch myself upon the world, alone and unassisted, to sink or swim as heaven may decree?"
"You would have, if you came to me for such a purpose," said Mr Hairdale calmly, "some reason to assign for conduct so extraordinary, which, if one may entertain the possibility of anything so wild and strange, would have its weight, of course."
"That, sir," she answered, "is the misery of my distress. I can give no reason whatever. My own bare word is all that I can offer. It is my duty, my imperative and bounden duty. If I did not discharge it, I should be a base and guilty wretch. Having said that, my lips are sealed, and I can say no more."
As though she felt relieved at having said so much, and had nerved herself to the remainder of her task, she spoke from this time with a firmer voice and heightened courage.
"Heaven is my witness, as my own heart is, and yours, dear young lady, will speak for me, I know, that I have lived, since that time we all have bitter reason to remember, in unchanging devotion and gratitude to this family. Heaven is my witness, that go where I may, I shall preserve those feelings unimpaired. And it is my witness, too, that they alone impel me to the course I must take, and from which nothing now shall turn me as I hope for mercy."
"These are strange riddles," said Mr Hairdale.
"In this world, sir," she replied, "they may, perhaps, never be explained. In another,
The truth will be discovered in its own good time. And may that time,' she added in a low voice, 'be far distant.'
'Let me be sure,' said Mr Haredale, 'that I understand you, for I am doubtful of my own senses. Do you mean that you are resolved voluntarily to deprive yourself of those means of support you have received from us so long, that you are determined to resign the annuity we settled on you 20 years ago, to leave house and home and goods and begin life anew, and this for some secret reason or monstrous fancy which is incapable of explanation, which only now exists and has been dormant all this time? In the name of God, under what delusion are you labouring?'
'As I am deeply thankful,' she made answer, 'for the kindness of those, alive and dead, who have owned this house, and as I would not have its roof fall down and crush me, or its very walls drip blood, my name being spoken in their hearing, I never will again subsist upon their bounty, or let it help me to subsistence. You do not know,' she added suddenly, 'to what uses it may be applied, into what hands it may pass. I do, and I renounce it.'
'Surely,' said Mr Haredale, 'its uses rest with you.'
'They did. They rest with me no longer. It may be, it is, devoted to purposes that mock the dead in their graves. It never can prosper with me. It will bring some other heavy judgment on the head of my dear son, whose innocence will suffer for his mother's guilt.'
'What words are these?' cried Mr Haredale, regarding her with wonder. 'Among what associates have you fallen? Into what guilt have you ever been betrayed?'
'I am guilty, and yet innocent; wrong, yet right; good in intention, though constrained to shield and aid the bad. Ask me no more questions, sir, but believe that I am rather to be pitied than condemned. I must leave my house to-morrow, for while I stay there, it is haunted. My future dwelling, if I am to live in peace, must be a secret. If my poor boy should ever stray this way, do not tempt him to disclose it, or have him watched when he returns, for if we are hunted, we must fly again. And now, this load is off my mind, I beseech you, and you, dear Miss Haredale too, to trust me if you can, and think of me kindly as you have been used to do. If I die, and cannot tell my secret even then, for that may come to pass, it will sit the lighter on my breast in that hour for this day's work, and on that day, and every day until it comes, I will pray for and thank you both, and trouble you no more.' With that, she would have left them, but they detained her, and with many soothing words and kind entreaties besought her to consider what she did, and above all to repose more freely upon them, and say what weighed so sorely on her mind. Finding her deaf to their persuasions, Mr Haredale suggested, as a last resource, that she should confide in Emma, of whom, as a young person and one of her own sex, she might stand in less dread than of himself. From this proposal, however, she recoiled with the same indescribable repugnance she had manifested when they met. The utmost that could be wrung from her was a promise that she would receive Mr Haredale at her own house next evening, and in the meantime reconsider her determination and their dissuasions, though any change on her part, as she told them, was quite hopeless. This condition made at last, they reluctantly suffered her to depart, since she would neither eat nor drink within the house, and she and Barnaby and Grip accordingly went out as they had come, by the private stair and garden gate, seeing and being seen of no one by the way. It was remarkable in the Raven that during the whole interview he had kept his eye on his book with exactly the air of a very sly human rascal, who, under the mask of pretending to read hard, was listening to everything. He still appeared to have the conversation very strongly in his mind, for although, when they were alone again, he issued orders for the instant preparation of innumerable kettles for purposes of tea, he was thoughtful, and rather seemed to do so from an abstract sense of duty, than with any regard to making himself agreeable, or being what is commonly called good company. They were to return by the coach. As there was an interval of full 2 hours before it started, and they needed rest and some refreshment, Barnaby begged hard for a visit to the Maypole. But his mother, who had no wish to be recognised by any of those who had known her long ago, and who feared besides that Mr Hairdale might, on second thoughts, dispatch some messenger to that place of entertainment in quest of her, proposed to wait in the churchyard instead. As it was easy for Barnaby to buy and carry thither such humble viands as they required, he cheerfully assented, and in the churchyard they sat down to take their frugal dinner. Here again the raven was in a highly reflective state, walking up and down when he had dined with an air of elderly complacency, which was strongly suggestive of his having his hands under his coat-tails, and appearing to read the tombstones with a very critical taste. Sometimes, after a long inspection of an epitaph, he would strop his beak upon the grave to which it referred, and cry in his hoarse tones, "I'm a devil! I'm a devil! I'm a devil!" But whether he addressed his observations to any supposed person below, or merely threw them off as a general remark, is matter of uncertainty. It was a quiet, pretty spot, but a sad one for Barnaby's mother, for Mr Reuben Hairdale lay there, and near the vault in which his ashes rested was a stone to the memory of her own husband, with a brief inscription recording how and when he had lost his life. She sat here, thoughtful and apart, until their time was out, and the distant horn told that the coach was coming. Barnaby, who had been sleeping on the grass, sprung up quickly at the sound, and Grip, who appeared to understand it equally well, walked into his basket straightway, entreating society in general, as though he intended a kind of satire upon them in connection with churchyards, never to say die on any terms. They were soon on the coach-top and rolling along the road. It went round by the Maypole and stopped at the door. Joe was from home, and Hugh came sluggishly out to hand up the parcel that it called for. There was no fear of old John coming out. They could see him from the coach roof, fast asleep in his cosy bar. It was a part of John's character. He made a point of going to sleep at the coach's time. He despised gadding about. He looked upon coaches as things that ought to be indicted, as disturbers of the peace of mankind, as restless, bustling, busy, horn-blowing contrivances quite beneath the dignity of men, and only suited to giddy girls that did nothing but chatter and go a-shopping.
"We know nothing about coaches here, sir," John would say, if any unlucky stranger made inquiry touching the offensive vehicles. "We don't book for 'em. We'd rather not. They're more trouble than they're worth, with their noise and rattle. If you like to wait for 'em, you can, but we don't know anything about 'em. They may call, and they may not. There's a carrier. He was looked upon as quite good enough for us when I was a boy."
She dropped her veil as Hugh climbed up, and while he hung behind and talked to Barnaby in whispers. But neither he nor any other person spoke to her, or noticed her, or had any curiosity about her, and so, an alien, she visited and left the village where she had been born, and had lived a merry child, a comely girl, a happy wife, where she had known all her enjoyment of life, and had entered on its hardest sorrows. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 26.
"And you're not surprised to hear this, Varden?" said Mr Hairdale. "Well, you and she have always been the best friends, and you should understand her if anybody does." "I ask your pardon, sir," rejoined the locksmith. "I didn't say I understood her. I wouldn't have the presumption to say that of any woman. It's not so easily done. but I am not so much surprised, sir, as you expected me to be, certainly. May I ask why not, my good friend?' 'I have seen, sir,' returned the locksmith with evident reluctance, 'I have seen in connection with her something that has filled me with distrust and uneasiness. She has made bad friends, how or when I don't know, but that her house is a refuge for one robber and cut-throat at least, I'm certain. There, sir. Now it's out.' 'Varden?' 'My own eyes, sir, are my witness, and for her sake I would be willingly half blind if I could but have the pleasure of mistrusting him. I have kept the secret till now, and it will go no further than yourself, I know. But I tell you that, with my own eyes, broad awake, I saw, in the passage of her house one evening after dark, the highwayman who robbed and wounded Mr Edward Chester, and on the same night threatened me.' 'And you made no effort to detain him?' said Mr Haredale quickly. 'Sir,' returned the locksmith, 'she herself prevented me, held me with all her strength, and hung about me until he had got clear off.' And having gone so far, he related circumstantially all that had passed upon the night in question. This dialogue was held in a low tone in the locksmith's little parlour, into which honest Gabriel had shown his visitor on his arrival. Mr Haredale had called upon him to entreat his company to the widow's, that he might have the assistance of his persuasion and influence, and out of this circumstance the conversation had arisen. 'I forbore,' said Gabriel, 'from repeating one word of this to anybody, as it could do her no good, and might do her great harm. I thought and hoped, to say the truth, that she would come to me and talk to me about it, and tell me how it was. But though I have purposely put myself in her way more than once or twice, she has never touched upon the subject, except by a look. And indeed,' said the good-natured locksmith, 'there was a good deal in the look, more than could have been put into a great many words. It said, among other matters, "Don't ask me anything," so imploringly that I didn't ask her anything. You'll think me an old fool, I know, sir. If it's any relief to call me one, pray do.' 'I am greatly disturbed by what you tell me,' said Mr Haredale after a silence. 'What meaning do you attach to it?' The locksmith shook his head, and looked doubtfully out of window at the failing light. 'She cannot have married again?' said Mr Haredale. 'Not without our knowledge, surely, sir. She may have done so in the fear that it would lead, if known, to some objection or estrangement. Suppose she married incautiously, it is not improbable, for her existence has been a lonely and monotonous one for many years, and the man turned out a ruffian. She would be anxious to screen him, and yet would revolt from his crimes. Now this might be. It bears strongly on the whole drift of her discourse yesterday, and would quite explain her conduct. Do you suppose Barnaby is privy to these circumstances?' 'Quite impossible to say, sir,' returned the locksmith, shaking his head again, 'and next to impossible to find out from him. If what you suppose is really the case, I tremble for the lad. A notable person, sir, to put to bad uses.' 'It is not possible, Varden,' said Mr Haredale, in a still lower tone of voice than he had spoken yet, 'that we have been blinded and deceived by this woman from the beginning. It is not possible that this connection was formed in her husband's lifetime, and led to his and my brother's—' 'Good God, sir!' cried Gabriel, interrupting him, 'don't entertain such dark thoughts for a moment. 25 years ago, where was there a girl like her? A gay, handsome, laughing, bright-eyed damsel. Think what she was, sir. It makes my heart ache now, even now, though I'm an old man with a woman for a daughter, to think what she was, and what she is. We all change, but that's with time. Time does his work honestly, and I don't mind him a fig for time, sir. Use him well, and he's a hearty fellow, and scorns to have you at a disadvantage. But care and suffering, and those have changed her, are devils, sir, secret, stealthy, undermining devils, who tread down the brightest flowers in Eden, and do more havoc in a month than time does in a year. Picture to yourself for 1 minute what Mary was before they went to work with her fresh heart and face. Do her that justice, and say whether such a thing is possible. "You're a good fellow, Varden," said Mr Hairdale, "and are quite right. I brooded on that subject so long that every breath of suspicion carries me back to it. You are quite right." "It isn't, sir," cried the locksmith with brightened eyes and sturdy honest voice. "It isn't because I courted her before Rudge and failed that I say she was too good for him. She would have been as much too good for me. But she was too good for him. He wasn't free and frank enough for her. I don't reproach his memory with it, poor fellow. I only want to put her before you as she really was. For myself, I'll keep her old picture in my mind, and thinking of that and what has altered her, I'll stand her friend and try to win her back to peace. And damn, sir," cried Gabriel, "with your pardon for the word, I'd do the same if she had married 50 highwaymen in a 12-month, and think it in the Protestant manual too, though Martha said it wasn't, tooth and nail till doomsday." If the dark little parlour had been filled with a dense fog, which, clearing away in an instant, left it all radiance and brightness, it could not have been more suddenly cheered than by this outbreak on the part of the hearty locksmith. In a voice nearly as full and round as his own, Mr Hairdale cried, "Well said!" and bade him come away without more parley. The locksmith complied right willingly, and both getting into a hackney coach which was waiting at the door, drove off straightway. They alighted at the street corner, and dismissing their conveyance, walked to the house. To their first knock at the door there was no response. A second met with the like result. But in answer to the third, which was of a more vigorous kind, the parlour window sash was gently raised, and a musical voice cried, "Hairdale, my dear fellow, I'm extremely glad to see you. How very much you have improved in your appearance since our last meeting. I never saw you looking better. How do you do?" Mr Hairdale turned his eyes towards the casement whence the voice proceeded, though there was no need to do so to recognise the speaker, and Mr Chester waved his hand and smiled a courteous welcome. "The door will be opened immediately," he said. "There is nobody but a very dilapidated female to perform such offices. You will excuse her infirmities. If she were in a more elevated station of society, she would be gouty. Being but a hewer of wood and drawer of water, she is rheumatic. My dear Hairdale, these are natural class distinctions, depend upon it." Mr Hairdale, whose face resumed its lowering and distrustful look the moment he heard the voice, inclined his head stiffly and turned his back upon the speaker. "Not opened yet?" said Mr Chester. "Dear me! I hope the aged soul has not caught her foot in some unlucky cobweb by the way. She is there at last. Come in, I beg." Mr Hairdale entered, followed by the locksmith. Turning with a look of great astonishment to the old woman who had opened the door, he inquired for Mrs Rudge, for Barnaby. They were both gone, she replied, wagging her ancient head, for good. There was a gentleman in the parlour who perhaps could tell them more. That was all she knew. "Pray, sir," said Mr Hairdale, presenting himself before this new tenant, "where is the person whom I came here to see?" 'My dear friend,' he returned, 'I have not the least idea.' 'Your trifling is ill-timed,' retorted the other in a suppressed tone and voice, 'and its subject ill-chosen. Reserve it for those who are your friends, and do not expend it on me. I lay no claim to the distinction, and have the self-denial to reject it.' 'My dear good sir,' said Mr Chester, 'you are heated with walking. Sit down, I beg. Our friend is but a plain honest man,' returned Mr Hairdale, 'and quite unworthy of your notice.' 'Gabriel Varden by name, sir,' said the locksmith bluntly. 'A worthy English yeoman,' said Mr Chester, 'a most worthy yeoman, of whom I have frequently heard my son Ned, darling fellow, speak, and have often wished to see. Varden, my good friend, I am glad to know you. You wonder now,' he said, turning languidly to Mr Hairdale, 'to see me here. Now I am sure you do.' Mr Haredale glanced at him, not fondly or admiringly, smiled, and held his peace. 'The mystery is solved in a moment,' said Mr Chester. 'In a moment. Will you step aside with me one instant? You remember our little compact in reference to Ned and your dear niece, Haredale? You remember the list of assistants in their innocent intrigue? You remember these two people being among them? My dear fellow, congratulate yourself and me. I have bought them off.' 'You have done what?' said Mr Haredale. 'Bought them off,' returned his smiling friend. 'I have found it necessary to take some active steps towards setting this boy and girl attachment quite at rest, and have begun by removing these two agents. You are surprised. Who can withstand the influence of a little money? They wanted it, and have been bought off. We have nothing more to fear from them. They are gone.' 'Gone?' echoed Mr Haredale. 'Where?' 'My dear fellow, and you must permit me to say again that you never looked so young, so positively boyish as you do to-night. The Lord knows where. I believe Columbus himself wouldn't find them. Between you and me, they have their hidden reasons, but upon that point I have pledged myself to secrecy. She appointed to see you here to-night, I know, but found it inconvenient, and couldn't wait. Here is the key of the door. I'm afraid you'll find it inconveniently large, but as the tenement is yours, your good nature will excuse that, Haredale, I am certain. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 27. Mr Haredale stood in the widow's parlour, with the door-key in his hand, gazing by turns at Mr Chester and at Gabriel Varden, and occasionally glancing downward at the key as in the hope that of its own accord it would unlock the mystery, until Mr Chester, putting on his hat and gloves, and sweetly inquiring whether they were walking in the same direction, recalled him to himself. 'No,' he said, 'our roads diverge widely, as you know. For the present, I shall remain here.' 'You will be hipped, Haredale. You will be miserable, melancholy, utterly wretched,' returned the other. 'It's a place of the very last description for a man of your temper. I know it will make you very miserable. Let it.
said Mr Hairdale, sitting down, and thrive upon the thought. Good night. Feigning to be wholly unconscious of the abrupt wave of the hand which rendered this farewell tantamount to a dismissal, Mr Chester retorted with a bland and heartfelt benediction, and inquired of Gabriel in what direction he was going. "Yours, sir, would be too much honour for the like of me," replied the locksmith, hesitating. "I wish you to remain here a little while, Varden," said Mr Hairdale, without looking towards them. "I have a word or two to say to you." "I will not intrude upon your conference another moment," said Mr Chester, with inconceivable politeness. "May it be satisfactory to you both. God bless you." So saying, and bestowing upon the locksmith a most refulgent smile, he left them. "A deplorably constituted creature, that rugged person," he said as he walked along the street. "He is an atrocity that carries its own punishment along with it, a bear that gnaws himself. And here is one of the inestimable advantages of having a perfect command over one's inclinations. I have been tempted in these 2 short interviews to draw upon that fellow 50 times. 5 men in 6 would have yielded to the impulse. By suppressing mine, I wound him deeper and more keenly than if I were the best swordsman in all Europe, and he the worst. You are the wise man's very last resource," he said, tapping the hilt of his weapon. "We can but appeal to you, when all else is said and done. To come to you before, and thereby spare our adversaries so much, is a barbarian mode of warfare, quite unworthy of any man with the remotest pretensions to delicacy of feeling or refinement." He smiled so very pleasantly as he communed with himself after this manner, that a beggar was emboldened to follow for alms, and to dog his footsteps for some distance. He was gratified by the circumstance, feeling it complimentary to his power of feature, and as a reward suffered the man to follow him until he called a chair, when he graciously dismissed him with a fervent blessing. "Which is as easy as cursing," he wisely added as he took his seat, "and more becoming to the face. To Clerkenwell, my good creatures, if you please." The chairmen were rendered quite vivacious by having such a courteous burden, and to Clerkenwell they went at a fair round trot. Alighting at a certain point he had indicated to them upon the road, and paying them something less than they expected from a fare of such gentle speech, he turned into the street in which the locksmith dwelt, and presently stood beneath the shadow of the Golden Key. Mr Tappertit, who was hard at work by lamplight in a corner of the workshop, remained unconscious of his presence, until a hand upon his shoulder made him start and turn his head. "Industry," said Mr Chester, "is the soul of business, and the keystone of prosperity. Mr Tappertit, I shall expect you to invite me to dinner when you are Lord Mayor of London."
"Sir," returned the 'prentice, laying down his hammer and rubbing his nose on the back of a very sooty hand, "I scorn the Lord Mayor and everything that belongs to him. We must have another state of society, sir, before you catch me being Lord Mayor. How d'ye do, sir?"
"The better, Mr Tappertit, for looking into your ingenuous face once more. I hope you are well?"
"I am as well, sir,"
said Sim, standing up to get nearer to his ear, and whispering hoarsely,
"as any man can be under the aggravations to which I am exposed. My life's a burden to me. If it wasn't for vengeance, I'd play at pitch and toss with it on the losing hazard."
"Is Mrs Varden at home?" said Mr Chester.
"Sir?"
returned Sim, eyeing him over with a look of concentrated expression.
"She is. Did you wish to see her?"
Mr Chester nodded.
"Then come this way, sir,"
said Sim, wiping his face upon his apron.
"Follow me, sir. Would you permit me to whisper in your ear 1/2 a second?"
By all means. Mr Tappertit raised himself on tiptoe, applied his lips to Mr Chester's ear, drew back his head without saying anything, looked hard at him, applied them to his ear again, again drew back, and finally whispered,
The name is Joseph Willet. Hush! I say no more.
Having said that much, he beckoned the visitor with a mysterious aspect to follow him to the parlour door, where he announced him in the voice of a gentleman usher, Mr Chester. And not Mr Eddard, mind, said Sim, looking into the door again, and adding this by way of postscript in his own person. It's his father. But do not let his father, said Mr Chester, advancing hat in hand as he observed the effect of this last explanatory announcement, do not let his father be any check or restraint on your domestic occupations, Miss Varden.
Oh, now, there! And I always a saying it, exclaimed Miggs, clapping her hands. If he hadn't been and took missus for her own daughter, well, she do look like it, that she do. Only think of that, Mim.
Is it possible, said Mr Chester in his softest tones, that this is Mrs Varden? I am amazed. That is not your daughter, Mrs Varden? No, no, your sister.
My daughter indeed, sir,
returned Mrs V, blushing with great juvenility. Ah, Mrs Varden, cried the visitor. Ah, ma'am, humanity is indeed a happy lot, when we can repeat ourselves in others, and still be young as they. You must allow me to salute you. The custom of the country, my dear madam. Your daughter, too. Dolly showed some reluctance to perform this ceremony, but was sharply reproved by Mrs Varden, who insisted on her undergoing it that minute. For pride, she said with great severity, was one of the 7 deadly sins, and humility and lowliness of heart were virtues, wherefore she desired that Dolly would be kissed immediately, on pain of her just displeasure, at the same time giving her to understand that whatever she saw her mother do, she might safely do herself, without being at the trouble of any reasoning or reflection on the subject, which, indeed, was offensive and undutiful, and in direct contravention of the Church Catechism. Thus admonished, Dolly complied, though by no means willingly, for there was a broad, bold look of admiration in Mr Chester's face, refined and polished though it sought to be, which distressed her very much. As she stood with downcast eyes, not liking to look up and meet his, he gazed upon her with an approving air, and then turned to her mother. My friend Gabriel, whose acquaintance I only made this very evening, should be a happy man, Mrs Varden.
Ah,
sighed Mrs V, shaking her head.
ah,
echoed Miggs. Is that the case? Said Mr Chester compassionately. Dear me.
Master has no intentions, sir,
murmured Miggs as she sidled up to him,
but to be as grateful as his nature will let him for everything he owns, which it is in his powers to appreciate. But we never, sir,
said Miggs, looking sideways at Mrs Varden, and interlarding her discourse with a sigh,
we never know the full value of some wines and fig trees till we lose 'em. So much the worse, sir, for them as has the lighting of 'em on their consciences when they're gone to be in full blow elsewhere.
And Miss Miggs cast up her eyes to signify where that might be. As Mrs Varden distinctly heard, and was intended to hear, all that Miggs said, and as these words appeared to convey in metaphorical terms a presage or foreboding that she would at some early period droop beneath her trials and take an easy flight towards the stars, she immediately began to languish, and taking a volume of the manual from a neighbouring table, leant her arm upon it as though she were hope, and that her anchor. Mr Chester, perceiving this, and seeing how the volume was lettered on the back, took it gently from her hand and turned the fluttering leaves. My favourite
book, dear madam. How often, how very often in his early life, before he can remember,' this clause was strictly true, 'have I deduced little easy moral lessons from its pages for my dear son Ned. You know Ned?' Mrs Varden had that honour, and a fine affable young gentleman he was. 'You're a mother, Mrs Varden,' said Mr Chester, taking a pinch of snuff, 'and you know what I, as a father, feel when he is praised. He gives me some uneasiness, much uneasiness. He's of a roving nature, ma'am, from flower to flower, from sweet to sweet, but his is the butterfly time of life, and we must not be hard upon such trifling.' He glanced at Dolly. She was attending evidently to what he said, just what he desired. 'The only thing I object to in this little trait of Ned's is,' said Mr Chester, 'and the mention of his name reminds me, by the way, that I am about to beg the favour of a minute's talk with you alone. The only thing I object to in it is, that it does partake of insincerity. Now, however I may attempt to disguise the fact from myself in my affection for Ned, still I always revert to this, that if we are not sincere, we are nothing. Nothing upon earth. Let us be sincere, my dear madam.'
'And Protestant,'
murmured Mrs Varden. 'And Protestant, above all things. Let us be sincere and Protestant, strictly moral, strictly just, though always with a leaning towards mercy, strictly honest and strictly true, and we gain, it is a slight point certainly, bacillus something tangible, we throw up a groundwork and foundation, so to speak, of goodness, on which we may afterwards erect some worthy superstructure.' Now, to be sure, Mrs Varden thought, here is a perfect character. Here is a meek, righteous, thoroughgoing Christian, who, having mastered all these qualities, so difficult of attainment, who, having dropped a pinch of salt on the tails of all the cardinal virtues, and caught them every one, makes light of their possession, and pants for more morality. For the good woman never doubted, as many good men and women never do, that this slighting kind of profession, this setting so little store by great matters, this seeming to say, 'I am not proud, I am what you hear, but I consider myself no better than other people, let us change the subject, pray,' was perfectly genuine and true. He so contrived it, and said it in that way that it appeared to have been forced from him, and its effect was marvellous. Aware of the impression he had made, few men were quicker than he at such discoveries, Mr Chester followed up the blow by propounding certain virtuous maxims, somewhat vague and general in their nature, doubtless, and occasionally partaking of the character of truisms, worn a little out at elbow, but delivered in so charming a voice, and with such uncommon serenity and peace of mind, that they answered as well as the best. Nor is this to be wondered at, for as hollow vessels produce a far more musical sound in falling than those which are substantial, so it will oftentimes be found that sentiments which have nothing in them make the loudest ringing in the world, and are the most relished. Mr Chester, with the volume gently extended in one hand, and with the other planted lightly on his breast, talked to them in the most delicious manner possible, and quite enchanted all his hearers, notwithstanding their conflicting interests and thoughts. Even Dolly, who, between his keen regards and her eyeing over by Mr Tappertit, was put quite out of countenance, could not help owning within herself that he was the sweetest spoken gentleman she had ever seen. Even Miss Miggs, who was divided between admiration of Mr Chester and a mortal jealousy of her young mistress, had sufficient leisure to be propitiated. Even Mr Tappertit, though occupied as we have seen in gazing at his heart's delight, could not wholly divert his thoughts from the voice of the other charmer. Mrs Varden, to her own private thinking, had never been so improved in all her life, and when Mr Chester, rising and craving permission to speak with her apart,
took her by the hand, and led her at arm's length upstairs to the best sitting-room, she almost deemed him something more than human. "Dear madam," he said, pressing her hand delicately to his lips, "be seated." Mrs Varden called up quite a courtly air, and became seated. "You guess my object," said Mr Chester, drawing a chair towards her. "You divine my purpose. I am an affectionate parent, my dear Mrs Varden."
"That I am sure you are, sir," said Mrs V.
"Thank you," returned Mr Chester, tapping his snuff-box lid. "Heavy moral responsibilities rest with parents, Mrs Varden." Mrs Varden slightly raised her hands, shook her head, and looked at the ground as though she saw straight through the globe, out at the other end, and into the immensity of space beyond. "I may confide in you," said Mr Chester, "without reserve. I love my son, ma'am, dearly, and loving him as I do, I would save him from working certain misery. You know of his attachment to Miss Hairdale. You have abetted him in it, and very kind of you it was to do so. I am deeply obliged to you, most deeply obliged to you, for your interest in his behalf. But, my dear ma'am, it is a mistaken one, I do assure you." Mrs Varden stammered that she was sorry. "Sorry, my dear ma'am," he interposed. "Never be sorry for what is so very amiable, so very good in intention, so perfectly like yourself. But there are grave and weighty reasons, pressing family considerations, and apart even from these, points of religious difference, which interpose themselves and render their union impossible, utterly impossible. I should have mentioned these circumstances to your husband, but he has, you will excuse my saying this so freely, he has not your quickness of apprehension or depth of moral sense. What an extremely airy house this is, and how beautifully kept! For one like myself, a widower so long, these tokens of female care and superintendence have inexpressible charms." Mrs Varden began to think, she scarcely knew why, that the young Mr Chester must be in the wrong, and the old Mr Chester must be in the right. "My son Ned," resumed her tempter with his most winning air, "has had, I am told, your lovely daughter's aid, and your open-hearted husband's."
"Much more than mine, sir," said Mrs Varden. "A great deal more. I have often had my doubts. It's a—"
"A bad example," suggested Mr Chester. "It is. No doubt it is. Your daughter is at that age when to set before her an encouragement for young persons to rebel against their parents on this most important point is particularly injudicious. You are quite right. I ought to have thought of that myself, but it escaped me. I confess, so far superior are your sex to ours, dear madam, in point of penetration and sagacity." Mrs Varden looked as wise as if she had really said something to deserve this compliment, firmly believed she had, in short, and her faith in her own shrewdness increased considerably. "My dear ma'am," said Mr Chester, "you embolden me to be plain with you. My son and I are at variance on this point. The young lady and her natural guardian differ upon it also, and the closing point is, that my son is bound by his duty to me, by his honour, by every solemn tie and obligation, to marry some one else."
"Engaged to marry another lady?"
quoth Mrs Varden, holding up her hands. "My dear madam, brought up, educated, and trained expressly for that purpose. expressly for that purpose. Miss Hairdale, I am told, is a very charming creature.'
'I am her foster mother, and should know. The best young lady in the world,' said Mrs Varden.
'I have not the smallest doubt of it. I am sure she is. And you, who have stood in that tender relation towards her, are bound to consult her happiness. Now, can I, as I have said to Hairdale, who quite agrees, can I possibly stand by and suffer her to throw herself away, although she is of a Catholic family, upon a young fellow who, as yet, has no heart at all? It is no imputation upon him to say he has not, because young men who have plunged deeply into the frivolities and conventionalities of society very seldom have. Their hearts never grow, my dear ma'am, till after 30. I don't believe, no, I do not believe, that I had any heart myself when I was Ned's age.'
'Oh, sir,' said Mrs Varden, 'I think you must have had. It's impossible that you, who have so much now, can ever have been without any.'
'I hope,' he answered, shrugging his shoulders meekly, 'I have a little. I hope very little, heaven knows. But to return to Ned. I have no doubt you thought, and therefore interfered benevolently in his behalf, that I objected to Miss Hairdale. How very natural, my dear madam. I object to him, emphatically to Ned himself.' Mrs Varden was perfectly aghast at the disclosure. 'He has, if he honourably fulfils this solemn obligation of which I have told you, and he must be honourable, dear Mrs Varden, or he is no son of mine, a fortune within his reach. He is of most expensive, ruinously expensive habits, and if in a moment of caprice and wilfulness he were to marry this young lady, and so deprive himself of the means of gratifying the tastes to which he has been so long accustomed, he would, my dear madam, he would break the gentle creature's heart. Mrs Varden, my good lady, my dear soul, I put it to you, is such a sacrifice to be endured? Is the female heart a thing to be trifled with in this way? Ask your own, my dear madam, ask your own, I beseech you.' Truly, thought Mrs Varden, this gentleman is a saint.
'But,' she added aloud, and not unnaturally, 'if you take Miss Emma's lover away, sir, what becomes of the poor thing's heart then?'
'The very point,' said Mr Chester, not at all abashed, 'to which I wished to lead you. A marriage with my son, whom I should be compelled to disown, would be followed by years of misery. They would be separated, my dear madam, in a 12-month. To break off this attachment, which is more fancied than real, as you and I know very well, will cost the dear girl but a few tears, and she is happy again. Take the case of your own daughter, the young lady downstairs, who is your breathing image.' Mrs Varden coughed and simpered. 'There is a young man, I am sorry to say a dissolute fellow of very indifferent character, of whom I have heard Ned speak. Bullet, was it? Pullet, Mullet?'
'There is a young man of the name of Joseph Willet, sir,' said Mrs Varden, folding her hands loftily.
'That's he!' cried Mr Chester. 'Suppose this Joseph Willet, now, were to aspire to the affections of your charming daughter, and were to engage them.'
'It would be like his impudence,' interposed Mrs Varden, bridling, 'to dare to think of such a thing.' 'My dear madam, that's the whole case. I know it would be like his impudence. It is like Ned's impudence to do as he has done, but you would not on that account,
or because of a few tears from your beautiful daughter, refrain from checking their inclinations in their birth. I meant to have reasoned thus with your husband when I saw him at Mrs Rudge's this evening.'
'My husband,' said Mrs Varden, interposing with emotion, 'would be a great deal better at home than going to Mrs Rudge's so often. I don't know what he does there. I don't see what occasion he has to busy himself in her affairs at all, sir.'
'If I don't appear to express my concurrence in those last sentiments of yours,' returned Mr Chester, 'quite so strongly as you might desire, it is because his being there, my dear madam, and not proving conversational, led me hither, and procured me the happiness of this interview with one in whom the whole management, conduct, and prosperity of her family are centred, I perceive.' With that he took Mrs Varden's hand again, and having pressed it to his lips with the high-flown gallantry of the day, a little burlesqued to render it the more striking in the good lady's unaccustomed eyes, proceeded in the same strain of mingled sophistry, cajolery, and flattery, to entreat that her utmost influence might be exerted to restrain her husband and daughter from any further promotion of Edward's suit to Miss Hairdale, and from aiding or abetting either party in any way. Mrs Varden was but a woman, and had her share of vanity, obstinacy, and love of power. She entered into a secret treaty of alliance, offensive and defensive, with her insinuating visitor, and really did believe, as many others would have done who saw and heard him, that in so doing she furthered the ends of truth, justice, and morality in a very uncommon degree. Overjoyed by the success of his negotiation, and mightily amused within himself, Mr Chester conducted her downstairs in the same state as before, and having repeated the previous ceremony of salutation, which also as before comprehended Dolly, took his leave, first completing the conquest of Miss Miggs's heart by inquiring if this young lady would light him to the door.
'Oh, Mim!'
said Miggs, returning with the candle.
'Oh, gracious me, Mim! There's a gentleman! Was there ever such an angel to talk as he is, and such a sweet-looking man, so upright and noble that he seems to despise the very ground he walks on, and yet so mild and condescending that he seems to say, but I will take notice on it too. And to think of his taking you for Miss Dolly, and Miss Dolly for your sister! Oh, my goodness me! If I was master, wouldn't I be jealous of him?'
Mrs Varden reproved her handmaid for this vain speaking, but very gently and mildly, quite smilingly indeed, remarking that she was a foolish, giddy, light-headed girl, whose spirits carried her beyond all bounds, and who didn't mean half she said, or she would be quite angry with her.
'For my part,' said Dolly in a thoughtful manner, 'I half believe Mr Chester is something like Miggs in that respect. For all his politeness and pleasant speaking, I'm pretty sure he was making game of us more than once.' 'If you venture to say such a thing again, and to speak ill of people behind their backs in my presence, miss,' said Mrs Varden, 'I shall insist upon your taking a candle and going to bed directly. How dare you, Dolly? I'm astonished at you. The rudeness of your whole behaviour this evening has been disgraceful. Did anybody ever hear,' cried the enraged matron, bursting into tears,
'of a daughter telling her own mother she has been made game of?'
What a very uncertain temper Mrs Varden's was. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 28. Repairing to a noted coffee-house in Covent Garden when he left the locksmith's, Mr Chester sat long over a late dinner, entertaining himself exceedingly with the whimsical recollection of his recent proceedings, and congratulating himself very much on his great cleverness. Influenced by these thoughts, his face wore an expression so benign and tranquil that the waiter in immediate attendance upon him felt he could almost have died in his defence, and settled in his own mind, until the receipt of the bill and a very small fee for very great trouble disabused it of the idea, that such an apostolic customer was worth half a dozen of the ordinary run of visitors at least. A visit to the gaming table, not as a heated, anxious venturer, but one whom it was quite a treat to see staking his 2 or 3 pieces in deference to the follies of society, and smiling with equal benevolence on winners and losers, made it late before he reached home. It was his custom to bid his servant go to bed at his own time unless he had orders to the contrary, and to leave a candle on the common stair. There was a lamp on the landing, by which he could always light it when he came home late, and having a key of the door about him, he could enter and go to bed at his pleasure. He opened the glass of the dull lamp, whose wick, burnt up and swollen like a drunkard's nose, came flying off in little carbuncles at the candle's touch, and scattered hot sparks about, rendered it matter of some difficulty to kindle a lazy taper, when a noise, as of a man snoring deeply some steps higher up, caused him to pause and listen. It was the heavy breathing of a sleeper close at hand. Some fellow had lain down on the open staircase and was slumbering soundly. Having lighted the candle at length and opened his own door, he softly ascended, holding the taper high above his head and peering cautiously about, curious to see what kind of man had chosen so comfortless a shelter for his lodging. With his head upon the landing, and his great limbs flung over half a dozen stairs, as carelessly as though he were a dead man whom drunken bearers had thrown down by chance, there lay Hugh, face uppermost, his long hair drooping like some wild weed upon his wooden pillow, and his huge chest heaving with the sounds which so unwontedly disturbed the place and hour. He who came upon him so unexpectedly was about to break his rest by thrusting him with his foot, when, glancing at his upturned face, he arrested himself in the very action, and stooping down and shading the candle with his hand, examined his features closely. Close as his first inspection was, it did not suffice, for he passed the light, still carefully shaded as before, across and across his face, and yet observed him with a searching eye. While he was thus engaged, the sleeper, without any starting or turning round, woke. There was a kind of fascination in meeting his steady gaze so suddenly, which took from the other the presence of mind to withdraw his eyes, and forced him, as it were, to meet his look. So they remained staring at each other, until Mr Chester at last broke silence, and asked him in a low voice why he lay sleeping there. "I thought," said Hugh, struggling into a sitting posture, and gazing at him intently still, "that you were part of my dream. It was a curious one. I hope it may never come true, master." "What makes you shiver?" The cold, I suppose," he growled as he shook himself and rose. "I hardly know where I am yet." "Do you know me?" said Mr Chester. I know you," he answered. "I was dreaming of you. We're not where I thought we were, and that's a comfort." He looked round him as he spoke, and in particular looked above his head, as though he half expected to be standing under some object which had had existence in his dream. Then he rubbed his eyes, and shook himself again, and followed his conductor into his own rooms. Mr Chester lighted the candles which stood upon his dressing-table, and wheeling an easy chair towards the fire, which was yet burning, stirred up a cheerful blaze, sat down before it, and bade his uncouth visitor come here and draw his boots off. "You have been drinking again, my fine fellow," he said, as Hugh went down on one knee, and did as he was told. "As I'm alive, master, I've walked the 12 long miles, and waited here, I don't know how long, and had no drink between my lips since dinner time at noon." "And can you do nothing better, my pleasant friend, than fall asleep and shake the very building with your snores?' said Mr Chester. 'Can't you dream in your straw at home, dull dog as you are, that you need to come here to do it? Reach me those slippers, and tread softly.' Hugh obeyed in silence. 'And harkye, my dear young gentleman,' said Mr Chester, as he put them on, 'the next time you dream, don't let it be of me, but of some dog or horse with whom you are better acquainted. Fill the glass once, you'll find it and the bottle in the same place, and empty it to keep yourself awake.' Hugh obeyed again, even more zealously, and having done so, presented himself before his patron. 'Now,' said Mr Chester, 'what do you want with me?' 'There was news to-day,' returned Hugh. 'Your son was at our house. Came down on horseback. He tried to see the young woman, but couldn't get sight of her. He left some letter or some message which our Joe had charge of, but he and the old one quarrelled about it when your son had gone, and the old one wouldn't let it be delivered. He says, that's the old one does, that none of his people shall interfere and get him into trouble. He's the landlord, he says, and lives on everybody's custom.' 'He's a jewel,' smiled Mr Chester, 'and the better for being a dull one. Well?' 'Varden's daughter, that's the girl I kissed.' 'And stole the bracelet from upon the King's highway?' said Mr Chester composedly. 'Yes. What of her?' 'She wrote a note at our house to the young woman, saying she lost the letter I brought to you, and you burnt. Our Joe was to carry it, but the old one kept him at home all next day, on purpose that he shouldn't. Next morning he gave it to me to take, and here it is.' 'You didn't deliver it then, my good friend?' said Mr Chester, twirling Dolly's note between his finger and thumb, and feigning to be surprised. 'I supposed you want to have it,' retorted Hugh. 'Burn one, burn all, I thought.' 'My devil-may-care acquaintance,' said Mr Chester, 'really, if you do not draw some nicer distinctions, your career will be cut short with most surprising suddenness. Don't you know that the letter you brought to me was directed to my son, who resides in this very place? And can you descry no difference between his letters and those addressed to other people?' 'If you don't want it,' said Hugh, disconcerted by this reproof, for he had expected high praise, 'give it me back, and I'll deliver it. I don't know how to please you, master.' 'I shall deliver it,' returned his patron, putting it away after a moment's consideration. 'Myself. Does the young lady walk out on fine mornings?' 'Mostly. About noon is her usual time.' 'Alone?' 'Yes, alone.' 'Where?' 'In the grounds before the house. Them that the footpath crosses.' 'If the weather should be fine, I may throw myself in her way to-morrow, perhaps,' said Mr Chester, as coolly as if she were one of his ordinary acquaintance. 'Mr Hugh, if I should ride up to the Maypole door, you will do me the favour only to have seen me once. You must suppress your gratitude, and endeavour to forget my forbearance in the matter of the bracelet. It is natural it should break out, and it does you honour, but when other folks are by, you must, for your own sake and safety, be as like your usual self as though you owed me no obligation whatever, and had never stood within these walls. You comprehend me?' Hugh understood him perfectly. After a pause, he muttered that he hoped his patron would involve him in no trouble about this last letter, for he had kept it back solely with the view of pleasing him. He was continuing in this strain, when Mr Chester, with the most beneficent and patronizing air, cut him short by saying, 'My good fellow, you have my promise, my word, my sealed bond, for a verbal pledge with me is quite as good, that I will always protect you. so long as you deserve it. Now, do set your mind at rest. Keep it at ease, I beg of you. When a man puts himself in my power so thoroughly as you have done, I really feel as though he had a kind of claim upon me. I am more disposed to mercy and forbearance under such circumstances than I can tell you, Hugh. Do look upon me as your protector, and rest assured, I entreat you, that on the subject of that indiscretion, you may preserve, as long as you and I are friends, the lightest heart that ever beat within a human breast. Fill that glass once more to cheer you on your road homewards. I am really quite ashamed to think how far you have to go. And then God bless you for the night. I think, said Hugh, when he had tossed the liquor down, that I'm sleeping soundly in the stable. The stable door's shut, but the steed's gone, master. You are a most convivial fellow, returned his friend, and I love your humour of all things. Good night. Take the greatest possible care of yourself, for my sake. It was remarkable that during the whole interview each had endeavoured to catch stolen glances of the other's face, and had never looked full at it. They interchanged one brief and hasty glance as Hugh went out, averted their eyes directly, and so separated. Hugh closed the double doors behind him, carefully and without noise, and Mr Chester remained in his easy chair, with his gaze intently fixed upon the fire. Well, he said, after meditating for a long time, and said with a deep sigh and an uneasy shifting of his attitude, as though he dismissed some other subject from his thoughts, and returned to that which had held possession of them all the day. The plot thickens. I have thrown the shell. It will explode, I think, in 48 hours, and should scatter these good folks amazingly. We shall see. He went to bed and fell asleep, but had not slept long when he started up, and thought that Hugh was at the outer door, calling in a strange voice, very different from his own, to be admitted. The delusion was so strong upon him, and was so full of that vague terror of the night in which such visions have their being, that he rose, and taking his sheathed sword in his hand, opened the door, and looked out upon the staircase, and towards the spot where Hugh had lain asleep, and even spoke to him by name. But all was dark and quiet, and creeping back to bed again, he fell, after an hour's uneasy watching, into a second sleep, and woke no more till morning. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 29. The thoughts of worldly men are for ever regulated by a moral law of gravitation, which, like the physical one, holds them down to earth. The bright glory of day and the silent wonders of a starlit night appeal to their minds in vain. There are no signs in the sun, or in the moon, or in the stars, for their reading. They are like some wise men who, learning to know each planet by its Latin name, have quite forgotten such small heavenly constellations as charity, forbearance, universal love, and mercy, although they shine by night and day so brightly that the blind may see them, and who, looking upward at the spangled sky, see nothing there but the reflection of their own great wisdom and book-learning. It is curious to imagine these people of the world, busy in thought, turning their eyes towards the countless spheres that shine above us, and making them reflect the only images their minds contain. The man who lives but in the breath of princes has nothing in his sight but stars for courtiers' breasts. The envious man beholds his neighbour's honours even in the sky. To the money hoarder, in the mass of worldly folk, the whole great universe above glitters with sterling coin, fresh from the mint, stamped with the sovereign's head, coming always between them and heaven, turn where they may. So do the shadows of our own desires stand between us and our better angels, and thus their brightness is eclipsed. Everything was fresh and gay, as though the world were but that morning made, when Mr Chester rode at a tranquil pace along the forest road. Though early in the season, it was warm and genial weather, the trees were budding into leaf, the hedges and the grass were green, the air was musical with songs of birds, and high above them all the lark poured out her richest melody. In shady spots the morning dew sparkled on each young leaf and blade of grass, and where the sun was shining, some diamond drops yet glistened brightly, as in unwillingness to leave so fair a world, and have such brief existence. Even the light wind, whose rustling was as gentle to the ear as softly falling water, had its hope and promise, and, leaving a pleasant fragrance in its track as it went fluttering by, whispered of its intercourse with summer, and of his happy coming. The solitary rider went glancing on among the trees, from sunlight into shade and back again, at the same even pace, looking about him certainly from time to time, but with no greater thought of the day or the scene through which he moved, than that he was fortunate, being choicely dressed, to have such favourable weather. He smiled very complacently at such times, but rather as if he were satisfied with himself than with anything else, and so went riding on upon his chestnut cob, as pleasant to look upon as his own horse, and probably far less sensitive to the many cheerful influences by which he was surrounded. In the course of time the Maypole's massive chimneys rose upon his view, but he quickened not his pace one jot, and with the same cool gravity rode up to the tavern porch. John Willet, who was toasting his red face before a great fire in the bar, and who, with surpassing foresight and quickness of apprehension, had been thinking, as he looked at the blue sky, that if that state of things lasted much longer, it might ultimately become necessary to leave off fires and throw the windows open, issued forth to hold his stirrup, calling lustily for Hugh. "Oh, you're here, are you, sir?" said John, rather surprised by the quickness with which he appeared. "Take this here valuable animal into the stable, and have more than particular care of him if you want to keep your place. A mortal lazy fellow, sir. He needs a deal of looking after." "But you have a son," returned Mr Chester, giving his bridle to Hugh as he dismounted, and acknowledging his salute by a careless motion of his hand towards his hat. "Why don't you make him useful?"
"Why, the truth is, sir," replied John with great importance, "that my son— What, you're a listening, are you, villain?"
"Who's listening?" returned Hugh angrily. "A treat indeed to hear you speak. Would you have me take him till he's cool?"
"Walk him up and down further off then, sir," cried old John, "and when you see me and a noble gentleman entertaining ourselves with talk, keep your distance. If you don't know your distance, sir," added Mr Willet, after an enormously long pause, during which he fixed his great dull eyes on Hugh, and waited with exemplary patience for any little property in the way of ideas that might come to him, "we'll find a way to teach you pretty soon."
Hugh shrugged his shoulders scornfully, and in his reckless swaggering way crossed to the other side of the little green, and there, with the bridle slung loosely over his shoulder, led the horse to and fro, glancing at his master every now and then from under his bushy eyebrows, with as sinister an aspect as one would desire to see. Mr Chester, who, without appearing to do so, had eyed him attentively during this brief dispute, stepped into the porch, and turning abruptly to Mr Willet, said, "You keep strange servants, John."
"Strange enough to look at, sir, certainly," answered the host, "but out of doors, for horses, dogs, and the likes of that. There ain't a better man in England than is that Maypole Hugh yonder. He ain't fit for indoors,' added Mr Willet, with the confidential air of a man who felt his own superior nature. 'I do that. But if that chap had only a little imagination, sir.' 'He's an active fellow now, I dare swear,' said Mr Chester in a musing tone, which seemed to suggest that he would have said the same had there been nobody to hear him. 'Active, sir?' retorted John, with quite an expression in his face. 'That chap? Hello there! You, sir? Bring that horse here, and go and hang my wig on the weathercock, to show this gentleman whether you're one of the lively sort or not.' Hugh made no answer, but throwing the bridle to his master, and snatching his wig from his head in a manner so unceremonious and hasty that the action discomposed Mr Willet not a little, though performed at his own special desire, climbed nimbly to the very summit of the maypole before the house, and hanging the wig upon the weathercock, sent it twirling round like a roasting jack. Having achieved this performance, he cast it on the ground, and sliding down the pole with inconceivable rapidity, alighted on his feet almost as soon as it had touched the earth. 'There, sir,' said John, relapsing into his usual stolid state. 'You won't see that at many houses besides the Maypole, where there's good accommodation for man and beast, nor that neither, though that with him is nothing.' This last remark bore reference to his vaulting on horseback, as upon Mr Chester's first visit, and quickly disappearing by the stable gate. 'That with him is nothing,' repeated Mr Willet, brushing his wig with his wrist, and inwardly resolving to distribute a small charge for dust and damage to that article of dress, through the various items of his guest's bill. 'He'll get out of almost any window in the house. There never was such a chap for flinging himself about, and never hurting his bones. It's my opinion, sir, that it's pretty nearly allowing to his not having any imagination, and that if imagination could be, which it can't, knocked into him, he'd never be able to do it any more. But we was a-talking, sir, about my son.' 'True, Willet, true,' said his visitor, turning again towards the landlord with his accustomed serenity of face. 'My good friend, what about him?' It has been reported that Mr Willet, previously to making answer, winked; but as he was never known to be guilty of such lightness of conduct, either before or afterwards, this may be looked upon as a malicious invention of his enemies, founded, perhaps, upon the undisputed circumstance of his taking his guest by the third breast-button of his coat, counting downwards from the chin, and pouring his reply into his ear. 'Sir,' whispered John with dignity, 'I know my duty. We want no love-making here, sir, unbeknown to parents. I respect a certain young gentleman, taking him in the light of a young gentleman. I respect a certain young lady, taking her in the light of a young lady. But of the two, as a couple, I have no knowledge, sir, none whatever. My son, sir, is upon his patrol.' 'I thought I saw him looking through the corner window but this moment,' said Mr Chester, who naturally thought that being on patrol implied walking about somewhere. 'No doubt you did, sir,' returned John. 'He is upon his patrol of honour, sir, not to leave the premises. Me and some friends of mine that use the Maypole of an evening, sir, considered what was best to be done with him, to prevent his doing anything unpleasant in opposing your desires, and we've put him on his patrol. And what's more, sir, he won't be off his patrol for a pretty long time to come, I can tell you that.' When he had communicated this bright idea,
which had its origin in the perusal by the village cronies of a newspaper, containing, among other matters, an account of how some officer, pending the sentence of some court-martial, had been enlarged on parole. Mr Willet drew back from his guest's ear, and without any visible alteration of feature, chuckled thrice audibly. This nearest approach to a laugh in which he ever indulged, and that but seldom and only on extreme occasions, never even curled his lip, or effected the smallest change in, no, not so much as a slight wagging of, his great fat double chin, which at these times, as at all others, remained a perfect desert in the broad map of his face, one changeless, dull, tremendous blank. Lest it should be matter of surprise to any that Mr Willet adopted this bold course in opposition to one whom he had often entertained, and who had always paid his way at the Maypole gallantly, it may be remarked that it was his very penetration and sagacity in this respect which occasioned him to indulge in those unusual demonstrations of jocularity just now recorded. For Mr Willet, after carefully balancing father and son in his mental scales, had arrived at the distinct conclusion that the old gentleman was a better sort of a customer than the young one. Throwing his landlord into the same scale, which was already turned by this consideration, and heaping upon him again his strong desires to run counter to the unfortunate Joe, and his opposition as a general principle to all matters of love and matrimony, it went down to the very ground straightway, and sent the light cause of the younger gentleman flying upwards to the ceiling. Mr Chester was not the kind of man to be by any means dim-sighted to Mr Willet's motives, but he thanked him as graciously as if he had been one of the most disinterested martyrs that ever shone on earth, and leaving him with many complimentary reliances on his great taste and judgment, to prepare whatever dinner he might deem most fitting the occasion, bent his steps towards the Warren. Dressed with more than his usual elegance, assuming a gracefulness of manner which, though it was the result of long study, sat easily upon him and became him well, composing his features into their most serene and prepossessing expression, and setting in short that guard upon himself at every point which denoted that he attached no slight importance to the impression he was about to make, he entered the bounds of Miss Hairdale's usual walk. He had not gone far, or looked about him long, when he descried coming towards him a female figure. A glimpse of the form and dress as she crossed a little wooden bridge which lay between them satisfied him that he had found her whom he desired to see. He threw himself in her way, and a very few paces brought them close together. He raised his hat from his head, and yielding the path, suffered her to pass him. Then, as if the idea had but that moment occurred to him, he turned hastily back, and said in an agitated voice, "I beg pardon. Do I address Miss Hairdale?" She stopped in some confusion at being so unexpectedly accosted by a stranger, and answered, "Yes." "Something told me," he said, looking a compliment to her beauty, "that it could be no other. Miss Hairdale, I bear a name which is not unknown to you, which it is a pride and yet a pain to me to know sounds pleasantly in your ears. I am a man advanced in life, as you see. I am the father of him whom you honour and distinguish above all other men. May I, for weighty reasons which fill me with distress, beg but a minute's conversation with you here?" Who that was inexperienced in deceit, and had a frank and youthful heart, could doubt the speaker's truth? Could doubt it, too, when the voice that spoke was like the faint echo of one she knew so well, and so much loved to hear? She inclined her head, and stopping, cast her eyes upon the ground. "A little more apart, among these trees. It is an old man's hand, Miss Hairdale, an honest one, believe me." She put hers in it as he said these words, and suffered him to lead her to a neighbouring seat. "You alarm me, sir," she said in a low voice. "You are not the bearer of any ill news, I hope?" "Of none that you anticipate," he answered, sitting down beside her. Edward is well, quite well. It is of him I wish to speak, certainly, but I have no misfortune to communicate. She bowed her head again, and made as though she would have begged him to proceed, but said nothing. I am sensible that I speak to you at a disadvantage, dear Miss Hairdale. Believe me that I am not so forgetful of the feelings of my younger days as not to know that you are little disposed to view me with favour. You have heard me described as cold-hearted, calculating, selfish.
I have never, sir,
she interposed with an altered manner and a firmer voice.
I have never heard you spoken of in harsh or disrespectful terms. You do a great wrong to Edward's nature if you believe him capable of any mean or base proceeding.
Pardon me, my sweet young lady, but your uncle—
Nor is it my uncle's nature either,
she replied, with a heightened colour in her cheek.
It is not his nature to stab in the dark, nor is it mine to love such deeds.
She rose as she spoke, and would have left him, but he detained her with a gentle hand, and besought her in such persuasive accents to hear him but another minute, that she was easily prevailed upon to comply, and so sat down again. And it is, said Mr Chester, looking upward and apostrophising the air, it is this frank, ingenuous, noble nature, Ned, that you can wound so lightly. Shame! Shame upon you, boy! She turned towards him quickly, and with a scornful look and flashing eyes. There were tears in Mr Chester's eyes, but he dashed them hurriedly away, as though unwilling that his weakness should be known, and regarded her with mingled admiration and compassion. I never, until now, he said, believed that the frivolous actions of a young man could move me like these of my own son. I never knew till now the worth of a woman's heart, which boys so lightly win and lightly fling away. Trust me, dear young lady, that I never until now did know your worth, and though an abhorrence of deceit and falsehood has impelled me to seek you out, and would have done so had you been the poorest and least gifted of your sex, I should have lacked the fortitude to sustain this interview could I have pictured you to my imagination, as you really are. Oh, if Mrs Varden could have seen the virtuous gentleman as he said these words, with indignation sparkling from his eyes, if she could have heard his broken, quavering voice, if she could have beheld him as he stood bareheaded in the sunlight, and with unwonted energy poured forth his eloquence. With a haughty face, but pale and trembling too, Emma regarded him in silence. She neither spoke nor moved, but gazed upon him as though she would look into his heart. I throw off, said Mr Chester, the restraint which natural affection would impose on some men, and reject all bonds but those of truth and duty. Miss Hairdale, you are deceived. You are deceived by your unworthy lover and my unworthy son. Still she looked at him steadily, and still said not one word. I have ever opposed his professions of love for you. You will do me the justice, dear Miss Hairdale, to remember that. Your uncle and myself were enemies in early life, and if I had sought retaliation, I might have found it here. But as we grow older, we grow wiser, bitter. I would fain hope, and from the first I have opposed him in this attempt. I foresaw the end, and would have spared you if I could.
Speak plainly, sir, she faltered. You deceive me, or are deceived yourself. I do not believe you. I cannot. I should not.
First, said Mr Chester soothingly, for there may be in your mind some latent angry feeling to which I would not appeal, pray take this letter. It reached my hands by chance and by mistake, and should have accounted to you, as I am told, for my son's not answering some other note of yours. God forbid, Miss Hairdale, said the good gentleman with great emotion, that there should be in your gentle breast one causeless ground of quarrel with him. You should know, and you will see, that he was in no fault here. There appeared something so very candid, so scrupulously honourable, so very truthful and just in this course, something which rendered the upright person who resorted to it so worthy of belief, that Emma's heart, for the first time, sunk within her. She turned away and burst into tears. I would, said Mr Chester, leaning over her and speaking in mild and quite venerable accents, I would, dear girl, it were my task to banish, not increase those tokens of your grief. My son, my erring son, I will not call him deliberately criminal in this, for men so young, who have been inconstant twice or thrice before, act without reflection, almost without a knowledge of the wrong they do, will break his plighted faith to you, has broken it even now. Shall I stop here, and having given you this warning, leave it to be fulfilled, or shall I go on? You will go on, sir, she answered, and speak more plainly yet, in justice both to him and me. My dear girl, said Mr Chester, bending over her more affectionately still, whom I would call my daughter, but the fates forbid, Edward seeks to break with you, upon a false and most unwarrantable pretence. I have it on his own showing, in his own hand. Forgive me, if I have had a watch upon his conduct. I am his father. I had a regard for your peace and his honour, and no better resource was left to me. There lies on his desk at this present moment, ready for transmission to you, a letter in which he tells you that our poverty, his and mine, Miss Hairdale, forbids him to pursue his claim upon your hand, in which he offers, voluntarily proposes, to free you from your pledge, and talks magnanimously, men do so very commonly in such cases, of being in time more worthy of your regard, and so forth. A letter, to be plain, in which he not only jilts you, pardon the word, I would summon to your aid your pride and dignity, not only jilts you, I fear, in favour of the object whose slighting treatment first inspired his brief passion for yourself, and gave it birth in wounded vanity, but affects to make a merit and a virtue of the act. She glanced proudly at him once more, as by an involuntary impulse, and with a swelling breast rejoined, If what you say be true, he takes much needless trouble, sir, to compass his design. He's very tender of my peace of mind. I quite thank him. The truth of what I tell you, dear young lady, he replied, you will test by the receipt or non-receipt of the letter of which I speak. Hairdale, my dear fellow, I am delighted to see you, although we meet under singular circumstances, and upon a melancholy occasion. I hope you are very well. At these words the young lady raised her eyes, which were filled with tears, and seeing that her uncle indeed stood before them, and being quite unequal to the trial of hearing or of speaking one word more, hurriedly withdrew and left them.
They stood looking at each other, and at her retreating figure, and for a long time neither of them spoke. "What does this mean? Explain it," said Mr Hairdale at length. "Why are you here, and why with her?" "My dear friend," rejoined the other, resuming his accustomed manner with infinite readiness, and throwing himself upon the bench with a weary air, "you told me not very long ago, at that delightful old tavern of which you are the esteemed proprietor, and a most charming establishment it is for persons of rural pursuits and in robust health, who are not liable to take cold, that I had the head and heart of an evil spirit in all matters of deception. I thought at the time, I really did think, you flattered me. But now I begin to wonder at your discernment, and, vanity apart, do honestly believe you spoke the truth. Did you ever counterfeit extreme ingenuousness and honest indignation? My dear fellow, you have no conception, if you never did, how faint the effort makes one." Mr Hairdale surveyed him with a look of cold contempt. "You may evade an explanation, I know," he said, folding his arms, "but I must have it. I can wait." "Not at all, not at all, my good fellow. You shall not wait a moment," returned his friend, as he lazily crossed his legs. "The simplest thing in the world. It lies in a nutshell. Ned has written her a letter, a boyish, honest, sentimental composition, which remains as yet in his desk, because he hasn't had the heart to send it. I have taken a liberty, for which my parental affection and anxiety are a sufficient excuse, and possessed myself of the contents. I have described them to your niece, a most enchanting person, Hairdale, quite an angelic creature, with a little colouring and description adapted to our purpose. It's done. You may be quite easy. It's all over. Deprived of their adherents and mediators, her pride and jealousy roused to the utmost, with nobody to undeceive her and you to confirm me, you will find that their intercourse will close with her answer. If she receives Ned's letter by tomorrow noon, you may date their parting from tomorrow night. No thanks, I beg. You owe me none. I have acted for myself, and if I have forwarded our compact with all the ardour even you could have desired, I have done so selfishly indeed." "I curse the compact, as you call it, with my whole heart and soul," returned the other. "It was made in an evil hour. I have bound myself to a lie. I have leagued myself with you, and though I did so with a righteous motive, and though it cost me such an effort as haply few men know, I hate and despise myself for the deed." "You are very warm," said Mr Chester with a languid smile. "I am warm. I am maddened by your coldness. Death, Chester, if your blood ran warmer in your veins, and there were no restraints upon me, such as those that hold and drag me back. Well, it is done. You tell me so, and on such a point I may believe you. When I am most remorseful for this treachery, I will think of you and your marriage, and try to justify myself in such remembrances for having torn asunder Emma and your son at any cost. Our bond is cancelled now, and we may part." Mr Chester kissed his hand gracefully, and with the same tranquil face he had preserved throughout, even when he had seen his companion so tortured and transported by his passion that his whole frame was shaken, lay in his lounging posture on the seat, and watched him as he walked away. "My scapegoat and my drudge at school," he said, raising his head to look after him. "My friend of later days, who could not keep his mistress when he had won her, and threw me in her way to carry off the prize. I triumph in the present and the past. Bark on, ill-favoured, ill-conditioned cur. Fortune has ever been with me. I like to hear you. The spot where they had met was in an avenue of trees. Mr Hairdale, not passing out on either hand, had walked straight on. He chanced to turn his head when at some considerable distance, and seeing that his late companion had by that time risen and was looking after him, stood still as though he half expected him to follow, and waited for his coming up. "It may come to that one day, but not yet," said Mr Chester, waving his hand as though they were the best of friends, and turning away. "Not yet, Hairdale. Life is pleasant enough to me, dull and full of heaviness to you. No, to cross swords with such a man, to indulge his humour, unless upon extremity, would be weak indeed." For all that, he drew his sword as he walked along, and in an absent humour ran his eye from hilt to point full 20 times. But thoughtfulness begets wrinkles. Remembering this, he soon put it up, smoothed his contracted brow, hummed a gay tune, with greater gaiety of manner, and was his unruffled self again. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80 by Charles Dickens. Chapter 30. A homely proverb recognizes the existence of a troublesome class of persons who, having an inch conceded them, will take an ell. Not to quote the illustrious examples of those heroic scourges of mankind, whose amiable path in life has been from birth to death through blood and fire and ruin, and who would seem to have existed for no better purpose than to teach mankind that as the absence of pain is pleasure, so the earth, purged of their presence, may be deemed a blessed place. Not to quote such mighty instances, it will be sufficient to refer to old John Willet. Old John, having long encroached a good standard inch, full measure, on the liberty of Joe, and having snipped off a Flemish ell in the matter of the parole, grew so despotic and so great that his thirst for conquest knew no bounds. The more young Joe submitted, the more absolute old John became. The ell soon faded into nothing. Yards, furlongs, miles arose, and on went old John in the pleasantest manner possible, trimming off an exuberance in this place, shearing away some liberty of speech or action in that, and conducting himself in his small way with as much high mightiness and majesty as the most glorious tyrant that ever had his statue reared in the public ways of ancient or of modern times. As great men are urged on to the abuse of power, when they need urging, which is not often, by their flatterers and dependents, so old John was impelled to these exercises of authority by the applause and admiration of his maypole cronies, who, in the intervals of their nightly pipes and pots, would shake their heads and say that Mr Willet was a father of the good old English sort, that there were no new-fangled notions or modern ways in him, that he put them in mind of what their fathers were when they were boys, that there was no mistake about him, that it would be well for the country if there were more like him, and more was the pity that there were not, with many other original remarks of that nature. Then they would condescendingly give Joe to understand that it was all for his good, and he would be thankful for it one day. And in particular Mr Cobb would acquaint him that when he was his age, his father thought no more of giving him a parental kick, or a box on the ears, or a cuff on the head, or some little admonition of that sort, than he did of any other ordinary duty of life. And he would further remark, with looks of great significance, that but for this judicious bringing up, he might have never been the man he was at that present speaking, which is probable enough, as he was, beyond all question, the dullest dog of the party. In short, between old John and old John's friends, there never was an unfortunate young fellow so bullied, badgered, worried, fretted, and browbeaten, so constantly beset, or made so tired of his life, as poor Joe Willet. This had come to be the recognised and established state of things, but as John was very anxious to flourish his supremacy before the eyes of Mr Chester, he did that day exceed himself, and did so goad and chafe his son and heir, that but for Joe's having made a solemn vow to keep his hands in his pockets when they were not otherwise engaged, it is impossible to say what he might have done with them. But the longest day has an end, and at length Mr Chester came downstairs to mount his horse, which was ready at the door. As old John was not in the way at the moment, Joe, who was sitting in the bar ruminating on his dismal fate and the manifold perfections of Dolly Varden, ran out to hold the guest's stirrup and assist him to mount. Mr Chester was scarcely in the saddle, and Joe was in the very act of making him a graceful bow, when old John came diving out of the porch and collared him.
"None of that, sir," said John. "None of that, sir. No breaking of patrols. How dare you come out of the door, sir, without leave? You're trying to get away, sir, are you, and to make a traitor of yourself again? What do you mean, sir?"
"Let me go, father," said Joe imploringly, as he marked the smile upon their visitor's face, and observed the pleasure his disgrace afforded him. "This is too bad. Who wants to get away?"
"Who wants to get away?" cried John, shaking him. "Why, you do, sir. You do. You're the boy, sir," added John, collaring with one hand, and aiding the effect of a farewell bow to the visitor with the other, "that wants to sneak into houses and stir up differences between noble gentlemen and their sons, are you, eh? Hold your tongue, sir."
Joe made no effort to reply. It was the crowning circumstance of his degradation. He extricated himself from his father's grasp, darted an angry look at the departing guest, and returned into the house. But for her, thought Joe, as he threw his arms upon a table in the common room and laid his head upon them, but for Dolly, who I couldn't bear should think me the rascal they would make me out to be if I ran away, this house and I should part to-night. It being evening by this time, Solomon Daisy, Tom Cobb, and Long Parkes were all in the common room too, and had from the window been witnesses of what had just occurred. Mr Willet, joining them soon afterwards, received the compliments of the company with great composure, and lighting his pipe, sat down among them.
"We'll see, gentlemen,"
said John, after a long pause,
"who's the master of this house, and who isn't. We'll see whether boys are to govern men, or men are to govern boys." "Quite right too," assented Solomon Daisy, with some approving nods. "Quite right, Johnny. Very good, Johnny. Well said, Mr Willet. Bravo, sir."
John slowly brought his eyes to bear upon him, looked at him for a long time, and finally made answer to the unspeakable consternation of his hearers.
"When I want encouragement from you, sir, I'll ask you for it. You let me alone, sir. I can get on without you, I hope. Don't you tackle me, sir, if you please." "Don't take it ill, Johnny. I didn't mean any harm," pleaded the little man. "Very good, sir," said John, more than usually obstinate after his late success. "Never mind, sir. I can stand pretty firm of myself, sir, I believe, without being shored up by you." And having given utterance to this retort, Mr Willet fixed his eyes upon the boiler, and fell into a kind of tobacco trance. The spirits of the company being somewhat damped by this embarrassing line of conduct on the part of their host, nothing more was said for a long time. But at length Mr Cobb took upon himself to remark, as he rose to knock the ashes out of his pipe,
that he hoped Joe would thenceforth learn to obey his father in all things, that he had found, that day, he was not one of the sort of men who were to be trifled with, and that he would recommend him, poetically speaking, to mind his eye for the future. "I'd recommend you, in return," said Joe, looking up with a flushed face, "not to talk to me."
Hold your tongue, sir,
cried Mr Willet, suddenly rousing himself and turning round. "I won't, father," cried Joe, smiting the table with his fist, so that the jugs and glasses rung again. "These things are hard enough to bear from you. From anybody else I never will endure them any more. Therefore I say, Mr Cobb, don't talk to me."
Why, who are you, said Mr Cobb sneeringly, that you're not to be talked to, eh, Joe?
To which Joe returned no answer, but with a very ominous shake of the head resumed his old position, which he would have peacefully preserved until the house shut up at night, but that Mr Cobb, stimulated by the wonder of the company at the young man's presumption, retorted with sundry taunts which proved too much for flesh and blood to bear. Crowding into one moment the vexation and the wrath of years, Joe started up, overturned the table, fell upon his long enemy, pummelled him with all his might and main, and finished by driving him with surprising swiftness against a heap of spittoons in one corner, plunging into which, head foremost, with a tremendous crash, he lay at full length among the ruins, stunned and motionless. Then, without waiting to receive the compliments of the bystanders on the victory he had won, he retreated to his own bedchamber, and considering himself in a state of siege, piled all the portable furniture against the door by way of barricade. "I've done it now," said Joe, as he sat down upon his bedstead and wiped his heated face. "I knew it would come at last. The Maypole and I must part company. I'm a roving vagabond. She hates me for evermore. It's all over." End of chapter 30.